On June 11th, 2020, Sony hosted a live stream titled The Future of Gaming. The focus of this event was all the amazing games available on the soon-to-be-released PlayStation 5. Tucked into the latter part of the presentation, right between Deathloop and Pragmata, was a sequel to one of the most successful video game franchises of all time, Resident Evil. This new game, Village, was met with immediate enthusiasm for its gothic Van Helsing aesthetic, and the fact that its prequel, Biohazard, sold buckets and received critical accolades from most of the gaming public. The hype was real. What interests me about this initial trailer, especially now 6 months after the game was released for public consumption, is the short prologue to the video. His story comes to a close. The he, in this case, being Ethan Winters, the main character from Resident Evil VII. For a series that built its identity on reusing the same characters and locations over and over, including remaking and remastering each of the first 4 games in the franchise, at least today, it's actually kind of weird to imagine them not milking Biohazard's central character for all he's worth. Yet, here we are, and I can safely say, without really spoiling anything more than the trailer itself, that, as the reveal video alludes, his story comes to a close. But, in the 3 months after this trailer, that line of marketing became muted. Most writing about the game in 2020 wondered aloud if the game would return to the most critically popular installment of the franchise, Resident Evil 4, and a pining for that style of horror gripped the minds of many hyped fans. Then, after the playable demo Maiden released on January 21st, 2021, public interest in Resident Evil Village became fixed on the attractive Lady Dimitrescu, a woman who I suspect needs no introduction to anyone who clicks on this video. Capcom's marketing department, sensing blood in the proverbial water, latched onto the fervor and released a second demo titled The Castle on April 24th, allowing players to explore Dimitrescu's home further. Thus, by the time May 7th rolled around and audiences actually got their hands on the latest installment of Resident Evil, that initial pitch that his story was ending was lost in a sea of lust and nostalgia. Still, I'm hooked on a question. What is his story? The one that's coming to a close. Despite being about a lot of things, as the length of this video indicates, Resident Evil Village is not a game about voluptuous women or a cash grab reminiscing about Leon S. Kennedy's escapades on the GameCube 15 years ago. We control Ethan on this wild ride through Eastern Europe, encountering werewolves, ocean men, and talking dolls. But the game's got so much more to say and do than simply be a ride through Spooky Town. The real story here has always been about Ethan Winters and his fear of becoming a father. A fear that, once conquered, absolves the character of needing to turn in another performance at the helm of a Resident Evil game. This adventure is the most intriguing aspect of Village, and the one we're going to explore in this video. You see, Village's greatest flaw is that it can't decide whether it wants to be a psychological exploration of the fear of parenthood or an action-oriented story about monsters and survival. I believe that when we strip back its excesses, Village is a surprising and emotionally deep dive into the subconscious of Ethan Winters, and each area of the game develops his fear of fatherhood further. You don't need to have played Village to watch this video. I'll give you all the context you need. Though, it's a fun experience, and I recommend that you do. Regardless of where you're coming from, I hope my discussion inspires you to look at Village in a new light. There's something profound the game is trying to say about being a parent, and I want to figure out what that is and if it's communicated well. I've got a lot to say, so let's punch this boulder. Perhaps paradoxically, I love horror movies, and I'm a complete scaredy cat. In particular, I get scared before I play horror video games. I actually like being scared. When a game or film does it well, it's a fun, memorable, and vivid experience. My problem, if we want to call it that, is that I get so scared I avoid playing games I would otherwise like. As I write this section, though not as I speak it, I'm sitting in a coffee shop on holiday, far away from my gaming computer, and I have not yet completed Resident Evil Village, the game I am supposedly reviewing in this video. I'd wager I'm just over halfway through the game, having just obtained a piece of rose from a creepy doll's house. I purchased the game on May 19th, 2021, and last played it on July 21st, which was almost 3 weeks ago from the time of this writing. This has been my pattern with the game. I play for a couple hours, absolutely love the experience of playing, then put down the game for weeks before I pick it up again. Editor's note, I played through the comparably lengthy Metroid Dread in just 3 days. It doesn't help that I'm relegated to playing this one alone, as my wife thinks the game is too scary for her. I personally find horror games much more palatable when I've got someone to experience them with. In fact, the last time I played the game, I streamed it to a small audience on Twitch to help me get over my fear. Likewise, since I became an adult, I haven't watched a horror movie alone. I'm not even the kind of person who grabs the arm of the person next to me in fear. I tend to be the person whose arm is grabbed. But, seemingly without cause, I avoid consuming horror media alone at all costs. There must be a reason, right? Well, that's what we're here to find out. I hope I'm not alone in being a scaredy cat, or else no one else is going to relate to this section. As you could probably guess, this pattern of picking up a horror game and being unable to play it isn't exactly a new experience for me, or rather, it isn't an experience wholly unique to my desire to make a video covering Resident Evil Village. Over the years, I purchased a variety of horror video games and have either failed to complete them, or worse, failed to even start them. I purchased Amnesia: The Dark Descent sometime in the early 2010s, and again, I loved the experience. But I also didn't make it more than 2 hours into the game. Looking at it now in my Steam library, the subtle gray letters declaring last played September 14th, 2013 reveals the depths of my fear. I simply avoided ever finishing it, ever finding out what happens next. Maybe the game was too vivid for me, the water monster too terrifying, but there are even horror games I've wanted to get into forever and just wholesale not played. I'm a big fan of the Alien franchise, and I've had Alien Isolation ready to play for years, but I've never even reached the start menu. Why don't I do what I want? Why don't I just play the damn game I'm excited to play, that I want to say that I've played? Why do I struggle to put the CD in the PlayStation and boot it up? I'm not yet entirely certain, but what I do know is that this relationship with horror games is incredibly deep. The most potent example I can point to all the way back when I was 14 years old, with, uncoincidentally, a Resident Evil game. 2004 was a pretty good year for the GameCube, seeing the release of Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, Pikmin 2, and Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, or TTYD or something like that. But I, a fresh-faced youngster with a GameCube, most looked forward to none of these exclusive titles. Instead, my eye was on January 11th, 2005, the release date of Resident Evil 4. Today, we know it as an instant classic, one of the most influential games of all time, partially responsible for kinda killing the survival horror genre too, as it bucked many of its conventions in favor of fast-paced action. Traditional survival horror tropes wouldn't come in vogue again for quite some time. More on that in the next section. But I come to you today to say no. Resident Evil 4 was not an instant classic. It was a pre-instant classic. Everyone seemed to know in the months leading up to 4 that it was going to be amazing. I was among those people singing its praises. I watched press release videos online and was so convinced I pre-ordered not just the game, but the GameStop exclusive collector's tin as well. It's still in storage up in my parents' place, and moreover, it's the only such collector's tin that I've ever bought and maybe ever will. We, being pretty much everyone who knew about it, were sure that Resident Evil 4 was going to be amazing because it looked amazing. Every iota of the game breeds a character wholly unfamiliar to me at the time. It was a fresh take on zombies. They were tactical, organized, and deadly. Most memorable to me now is all the marketing material around the Chainsaw Man. I knew my tussles with his foe would be legendary. And so I went on release day, a 30-minute drive with my mom to the mall in the city neighboring our rural town to get Resident Evil 4 as soon as possible. I came home, popped it into the GameCube in my room, knowing I had an hour or two before I had to go to bed in the evening, and started to play. I advanced through the shaded woods before the town of zombified villagers, finding some quick action cutscenes and the first typewriter along the way, which is a serious staple for save points. I trembled as I approached the town, and a male villager yelled in my direction some indiscernible Spanish to my naive mind. I fought them for a bit before getting overwhelmed by their numbers. Frightened, I ran. I ran all the way back to the typewriter, saved the game, shut off my GameCube, and went to bed. I would not play Resident Evil 4 again for months. Where did all my fervor and excitement to play the game go exactly? It's not like I was a terrible player afraid of failure. I had played through all of Metroid Prime, Wind Waker, and Super Mario Sunshine, which were comparably difficult games to Resident Evil. The game was as fun as I thought it would be, but the confrontation with those villagers revealed with full intensity the depth of how much of a scaredy cat I am. Though, I find today that I was not scared of those villagers, even the bloody chainsaw man with a menacing burlap sack over his face. I was afraid of being afraid, and the game's marketing and ambience had sold me on the idea that this was an experience I was going to dread, albeit in an absolutely delightful way. My time playing Resident Evil 0, a game which I could also only play in spurts due to its horror elements, primed me to approach Resident Evil 4 with similar trepidation. It suggested just enough anxiety that I placeboed myself into thinking I was more scared than I actually was. If I had been told outright that Resident Evil 4 was an action game, which it is, or if it had been sold to me under the moniker of Call of Duty or Medal of Honor, would I have been as scared of it? We don't need to guess. Only 2 years later, I would play through all of Gears of War, a game with about the same amount of horror as Resident Evil 4, if we're being honest. As evidenced by my terrible ability to finish Resident Evil Village this year, I did not change. It was the shape the game came in that changed. Sell me a horror game while telling me it's an action game, I can play it with ease. Sell me an action game while telling me it's a horror experience, I'm fucked. An anxiety-riddled mess. It may surprise longtime viewers of this channel that at the same time I was blasting my way through Ultrakill's cyber grind with dastardly efficiency, I was wasting ammunition, missing shots on easy-to-hit zombies in Village. My aim was shaky at best, actively harming my ability to complete the game at worst. It might also surprise them to know that despite my apparent love for all manner of puzzle games and even speedrunning them like Minesweeper, I occasionally struggled to complete some of the simplest puzzles in Resident Evil 8, being more afraid of what's coming next than focused on the simple fire lantern puzzle in front of me. Again, it's not the game's beautiful aesthetic, terrifying sound design, or fantastic mood that does me in, though those things certainly help. It's the expectation that I'm going to be scared, that there will be something around that corner to scare me. That scares me more than any of those things possibly could. Expectations are a crucial part of all media consumption. When you go to see a comedy at the theater, you expect to laugh, so you are more likely to find its humor funny. When you click on a Tom Scott video on YouTube, you expect to learn something, so take on a more curious stance. And when you boot up a Resident Evil game, you expect to be scared, and thus become more paranoid. One thing that's true of me, and I suspect a lot of people, is that expectation is as powerful as the media itself. It can make you believe for a moment that a mediocre TV series is actually great, or that a song you otherwise love is pretty bad. That's why game advertising and its consequential hype tend to be so important in the landscape of the industry. It helps set up the player's expectations, which in turn manipulates their opinions. What's so funny about my Resident Evil story is that those expectations worked against the game. RE4 is actually one of the best action games of the 2000s, and not even close to one of the best horror games. That's Silent Hill 2, but that's a topic for another video. The damage was done. By the end of 2005, I would play through and beat Resident Evil 4, and I come to you today having beaten Resident Evil Village. I swear, really, I was scared the whole time, but I beat it. Fear did not outdo me as hard as I tried to let it. Let's be clear though, I wanted to be scared by Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil Village. I didn't buy these games expecting something else. So, let's return to the initial question. Why do I struggle to get over the hump of actually playing the game? I think the answer is simple: motivation. Unlike a horror film, when you press play on a horror game, you are setting yourself up for an interactive experience where you must engage with fear, not just by choosing to play the game, but in every action that you take along the way. When you play a video game, you always have the option to quit out, go do something else instead of proceeding forward. For me, when I get scared, my motivation drops low, and the temptation to quit becomes stronger. And eventually, that temptation wins. It's not that the game isn't fun, or that I'm so scared I fear for my own health, but that the more scared I am, the less I want to interact with the game. When watching The Ring or Midsummer, especially in the theater, I can't turn it off. I can't stop the dread, so I sit in it, let it wash over me, and ultimately enjoy it. When I play a video game, the ratcheting tension pulls me under and drowns my artistic sensibilities. The easiest way to conquer my fear and subsequent lack of motivation is through the aid of other people. When I played Amnesia: The Dark Descent with my wife, I couldn't quit out. She was enjoying watching me play the game, or at least I think she was, and thus my motivation to keep pushing through the fear remained high. Moreover, I also have a desire to display myself as someone who can handle horror media, not a scaredy cat, despite the fact that I made this entire section just telling you that I am a scaredy cat, and thus I act less like the frightful little kitty I am when I'm in the presence of others. If comedy is funnier with other people because their laughs spur on your own, horror media is better with other people because it allows that more individualistic and localized fear to become social. That social element not only makes it more bearable, it makes it more enjoyable. It turns individual presumptions into collective expectations. The tricky thing though is that horror games work best as single-player affairs. Some amazing social horror experiences do exist, like Dead by Daylight and Phasmophobia, but the vast majority of horror games tend to lean into the single-player because I suspect most people are not as demotivated by fear as I am, or maybe they just have less squeamish partners. Or maybe they are single-player because that demotivation and the ability to push past the fear is the key to the genre as a whole. One question remains though. If, after Resident Evil 4, I knew that Resident Evil was an action game series, why was I so afraid of Resident Evil Village? For that, we're going to have to discuss the curse of the video game sequel. In my estimation, games are the medium most conducive to the proliferation and production of sequels. This is for a variety of reasons. First, games are more naturally varied than other forms of media because of the interactive component. Playing through Doom twice yields different experiences. So many contingent possibilities exist within the game, secrets to find or not find, different ways to approach each situation, so much so that each playthrough is meaningfully unique. So, of course, Doom 2 then is going to feel different, even if it is built off the same engine. Meanwhile, if you rewatch a film, you can be assured that it will be the exact same film again. This makes it easier to get people to buy into the idea of a video game sequel, Especially if you've already played through a game like Resident Evil 2 or 3 times, the idea of a successor sounds even more enticing. Second, games are more easily improved upon when making a sequel. I mean this in the most literal of ways. Sure, a film could reuse the same sets and actors for a sequel, but that pales in comparison to reusing the same code. Many sequels are built in the same engine as their predecessors, one less thing to worry about in the development. A game like Majora's Mask simply reuses most of the assets from its prequel, Ocarina of Time, and still manages to churn out an entirely different experience. This is because the arrangement of parts matters, and it's easy to rearrange the same code into a new, fresh game. Moreover, if the sequel is using mostly the same parts as its predecessor, then the game's designers can focus more on the details, making quality of life improvements to an existing system, and adding more on top of that system as well. Whereas the first game, they were mostly working from scratch. On that note, making a new, fresh game isn't easy. Developing an engine, graphical assets, characters, places, controls, etc., is incredibly taxing for a studio, let alone all those pesky little game design decisions on how the world feels to play in. Even games you might not think of as sequels still owe much of their existence to each other. Ocarina of Time, for instance, was made from a modified version of Super Mario 64's engine. Half-Life was built out of the Quake engine, and the latest version of Professional Evolution Soccer, or PES, uses Metal Gear Solid 5's Fox engine. There's a lot of engine lovemaking going around. If you're going to be using the same engine, it doesn't take too long to start wondering, can we use the same characters? I mean, players liked squashing Goombas in Super Mario Bros. Why can't they just jump on some more here? Finally, video games are expensive to make, and the market they are sold in is incredibly volatile. It's easy to imagine stepping back up to the cash cow that you just milked for a profit and asking it for more to sell at market. A franchise is a golden goose, no reason to go chasing other fowl. While probably every designer yearns at least a little bit to make something wholly original and unique, market forces, in tandem with the need to actually ship a game rather than twiddle around in the design phase forever, makes the process of designing and selling a sequel quite appealing. All of this leads to a context where, especially in the bigger, more cash-conscious studios, sequels get greenlit. And quite often. The Resident Evil franchise is no exception. Even the original Resident Evil is a sequel of sorts to the NES game Sweet Home. Sweet Home inspired many survival horror titles in the years after its release, but Resident Evil was initially conceived as a remake of the game. Remakes are really just blunt and unimaginative sequels if you think about it. Resident Evil evolved from being Sweet Home Redux for a variety of reasons, but Tokuro Fujiwara, the director of Sweet Home, still remained as producer of the game, and he handpicked Shinji Mikami, a protege, to direct it. Both games have a lot in common. They are set in haunted mansions, feature multiple endings, have limited items, lots of puzzles, and have mysteries to uncover through hidden notes. Many of these features are the stock and trade of survival horror now, but Sweet Home is ground zero for some of these design and aesthetic decisions, or at least their popularization. Through its connection to Sweet Home, we can see that Resident Evil, since its inception, and more so than your average video game, has always been some kind of sequel. So, we can't talk about Resident Evil Village without considering its context as a main game sequel in one of the most important video game franchises of all time. Sequels always face a conundrum. How much should they be like the media they are succeeding, and how much should they break apart? When people go to see Spider-Man 2, they are expecting to see more Spider-Man, but they don't want to just experience Spider-Man again. They want something new, right? If a sequel isn't new enough, people will complain, perhaps be less likely to put money down on the next installment in the series. Thus, most of the effort spent in marketing sequels actually tries to separate the product from what came before, trying to prove that it's not just more of the same. Yes, the fact that it is more of the same is the primary selling point, but the average person already knows that, so they must be convinced that it's better enough to eclipse the feeling of, we already have that at home. No, Mom, we don't have Resident Evil 4 at home. We have Resident Evil 1, which is, frankly, a completely different game. Completely different genre, for that matter. This is a problem that plagues all sequels. They attempt to remain cohesive with what came before them, while not being too cohesive. How they rectify that issue tells us a lot about how the creators view the original, both in terms of what they find most valuable about it, and what they think the audience wants to see more of. The conundrum is compounded for horror media because what is frightening changes over time. What is scary today will be outdated, campy, or funny tomorrow. I remember as a youngster being terrified of Signs, a movie barely scary at all, and being terribly scarred by a scene from Rob Zombie's Texas Chainsaw Massacre that should not have been on my friend's television at 8 a.m. on Sunday before church. Yet, at the same age, I could watch the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Thing, genuinely frightening and high-quality films, but they did not have a lasting impact on me. They did not strike fear into me, simply because they were old, outdated. I would see the look of their cameras, the muted colors, the antiquated fashion, the archaic technology, and immediately my young mind could perceive the artifice in front of me. This wasn't real life. This was fiction. This isn't to say that horror can't be good after its heyday. I love The Thing, The Shining, The Fly, a lot of great movies titled like that. But do they terrify me? No, not so much. Resident Evil, as gaming's premier survival horror franchise, has wrestled with this reality of horror media since its inception, and has struggled to maintain a consistent shape since its initial installment. Before we get to discussing Village, it is useful to consider how the franchise has reinvented itself, both for ill and woe, to stay relevant. As we already noted, the original Resident Evil, also known as Biohazard, which will be important later, is a reinvention of Sweet Home. But whereas Sweet Home is your standard haunted house affair, like a Conjuring movie or something, Resident Evil is a more bureaucratic kind of horror, both in terms of who the player is, a member of police special forces, not a documentary crew, and where the story is set, not at some reclusive artist mansion, but at the secret laboratory of an international pharmaceutical company, Umbrella Corp. They'll keep being important for ever in this series. What is always consistent about Resident Evil is the turn to a bigger story about organizations and government, as we will see. Village is no exception to this rule. From Resident Evil 2 through 6, the games trend towards shedding their survival horror mechanics for action-adventure ones. Resident Evil 2's introduction, which features an entire city zombie-ravaged, literally on fire and on the verge of collapse, immediately ups the ante from Resident Evil 1's simpler haunted house vibe. Here the franchise reinvents itself less as an intimate horror experience and more as a bombastic action horror film monster. It's at least a little surprising that the series creators felt the need to do this here, but it paid off, with Resident Evil 2 bringing the already successful series to more critical and commercial success, cementing it as the premier franchise it is today. The intimacy of the haunted house is still here. We can find it in the extended police station section and labyrinthine sewers. The basic gameplay with fixed camera angles, a need to conserve supplies, and focus on spooking the player remains mostly unchanged. It's still a survival horror experience, but we can see in the tone of the game, its setting, plot, and characters, a gradual turn toward a more overwhelming and quickly paced game than the more subdued atmosphere of Resident Evil I. Resident Evil III, by contrast to the more dramatic shifts between 1 and 2, plays it safe, mostly retreading RE2's narrative beats with some added systems on top. Something can be said for polishing and remixing a formula, and both RE2 and 3 figured out ways to revamp the basic aspects of Resident Evil 1. But with the turn of a new console generation, the franchise started to stagnate. Games like Resident Evil 0 and the fantastic remake of 1 on the GameCube helped keep the franchise in the public's mind, but the fixed camera gameplay was frankly unbecoming of a franchise with greater ambitions, especially in the shadow of new action games that proved consoles could be a place for such experiences. Resident Evil 4 thus had to reinvent the wheel, and reinvent it did. Credited not just with diverting the franchise away from its roots, but changing the face of the character action game permanently. While I wouldn't go so far as Nintendo Power and others who label it as one of the greatest GameCube games of all time, that honor goes to, you tell me in the comments, how about that? The appeal is obviously there though. What is interesting to us today is how Resident Evil 4 changed the franchise's direction and what that means for Village. The most obvious change, at least in terms of game feel, is the divorce from fixed camera angles. Cameras, whether in a video game or film, reveal information, but what horror media often understand better than most is that they also conceal it. The first 3 Resident Evil games live in this space. It's the fact that you can't easily see what's around that corner without moving there yourself that makes these games scary, builds dread in the player. Players are incredibly crafty and devilish, and if you give them control over a camera, they can use it to mitigate the horror aspects of the game by peeking around corners or manipulating it in such a way as to bypass jump scares and dangerous situations. They're just too smart for their own good. These fixed camera angles, almost painted on the screen rather than rendered, also gave Resident Evil games a higher fidelity of graphics than many of their contemporaries, but by the development of Resident Evil 4, the contemporaries had caught up, and more importantly, the drawback of fixed camera angles, primarily the unintuitive and wonky controls that come with them, started to wear thin on audiences. Thus, Resident Evil 4 did away with them and placed the camera squarely over Leon S. Kennedy's shoulder. Not quite first person, not quite third person. The protagonist of the second game became much more dangerous with a view of the action, requiring larger hordes of more complex enemies and a new focus on precise aiming to keep the gameplay engaging and interesting. This also results in a less scary game, at least on the surface, because the tone of the camera is set by the player, not the designer. But I want to give the over-the-shoulder camera some credit. It is intuitive, so intuitive that it became the standard for the industry moving forward, and it manages to do so without sacrificing all of the series' sensibilities. You still can't look behind you, for instance, while you're running away from things. Thus, in a way, in order to experience the game, you must face it head on, whereas a camera scheme like Super Mario 64 would allow the player to look wherever they want, whenever they want. Freedom is frankly overrated. Resident Evil 4 also leans hard on the action-oriented gameplay. The other games often end with bombastic rocket launcher field scenes of gratuitous and explosive violence, but none had spent so much effort on making the player character as much of a badass as the Secret Service agent, Leon S. Kennedy. Leon's gun has a laser point attached to it, for goodness sake. The moment I saw that as a teenager, I knew exactly what kind of game this was, and it was not Silent Hill 2. Whereas an enemy like RE3's Nemesis feels dangerous and indomitable, an Everest of a video game boss, nothing in Resident Evil 4, save for a few crappy enemies like Regenerators, feels so invincible. They feel more like characters in a play or action movie. They say silly lines and quips like Leon's response to Salazar's threat that he's sending his right hand to deal with the main character. Your right hand comes off? These games have never taken themselves too seriously, at least compared to some other survival horror games, but it was here at 4 where Capcom was rewarded by turning away from the franchise's survival horror roots to embrace the schlock and action of the concurrently released film adaptations of the franchise. If the hints were there in 4, they were proved true in Resident Evil 5 and 6. 2 games which fully embrace the action side of things. I don't feel an urgent need to talk about these games. I don't find them particularly interesting or relevant to Village, other than to say that the most important game to understand Village 7 is certainly a reaction and reinvention due to the stagnation the series experienced as a result of the action-oriented mistakes almost that were 5 and 6. It is a dangerous thing for a series to start losing its identity, which is what happened especially when Resident Evil 6 came around. A game so far removed from Sweet Home and Resident Evil 1 that if you removed their labels, it'd be difficult to even place them in the same series. The franchise reached a point of such dilution that it became difficult to say for certain what made a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game. From this giant mess, we get Village's direct predecessor, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Biohazard had the unenviable goal of getting people to actually care about Resident Evil again, and finally, instead of moving away from haunted houses and spooky protagonists, it worked its way back toward what made Sweet Home and RE1 so successful in the first place. Even its subtitle, Biohazard, is an evocation of the Japanese title of the first game. For all intents and purposes, Biohazard is an attempt to reclaim what made the franchise unique and interesting. Thus, perhaps surprisingly, the first thing that had to go was those third-person controls in favor of first-person ones. Sadly, fixed camera angles are so completely out of style that we may never see them come back, but first-person view does manage to get the player closer to the vibe of these old games by limiting what the player can see. Just as important as the change in camera is removing the expectation of player empowerment. There are no hordes of enemies to mow down in Biohazard. Instead, enemies feel unkillable, and the most obvious solution is to run from them rather than confront them. This generates a terrifying game with a fantastic tone, turning all that eye for detail afforded a AAA game into a splendid, horrific experience. What Biohazard mostly fails to do, though, is actually present something fresh to the audience. Sure, if you had been living under a rock only playing Resident Evil games, you might not have noticed, but there were many good survival horror games released in the years leading up to Biohazard, including PT, whose success likely proved to Capcom that there was an appetite for true AAA survival horror games. Biohazard thus is less a trailblazer and more a follower of trends of its time, which is a slightly weird place for the franchise, considering what sparks of influence the original game and especially 4 ended up being. Still, it is a particularly competent game. In it, we follow Ethan Winters, not a member of police special forces, not someone with extensive military experience, not a secret agent working for the government or Umbrella Corps, just a guy looking for his wife. Biohazard reaches back as much as it reaches forward. Ethan's story is evocative of James Sunderland's from Silent Hill 2, both white men motivated by their missing wives to enter creepy places. The documentary crew, whose VHS Ethan finds, is a clear reference to the original Sweet Home, where the player is a documentary crew. The Baker family's mannerisms and activities resemble the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the whole thing has a similar haunted house vibe to the original Resident Evil. It's a more intimate horror experience, and surprising for Resident Evil. No hordes of zombies, though in the end it does turn back toward bureaucratic nightmare, with Chris Redfield and Umbrella Corps swooping in to save the day. I actually don't think it's Umbrella Corps at the end. I think I messed that up. Oh well. Biohazard was a huge success, but ultimately put its sequel, Village, in a difficult situation. How exactly do you follow up a game that was novel more because of the franchise it's in than its actual gameplay? If you make Biohazard 2.0 with similar beats, much of what made Biohazard feel fresh in the first place will come across as stale, unoriginal. Yet, if you divorce too much from the recipe that brought the series some newfound acclaim, you risk alienating people who expect more of the same. The classic sequel conundrum rears its head yet again. Village does not get Biohazard's luxury of getting to start with a clean slate. Fortunately, it is a much more interesting game for the trouble, though not necessarily better game. Just like how Resident Evil 2 started to move away from the haunted house aesthetic, Village feels a similar urge to not be too much like Biohazard, and as a result starts to veer towards some of the series' more action-oriented trends, but not so much so as to make an entirely new game. Village has haunted house segments, but it is not a haunted house game. It significantly dials up the action from Biohazard, with hordes of lichens attacking the player in the opening moments of the action, but has some of the most intimate and spooky moments the series has to offer. It returns to the franchise's opulent tendencies with castles, fairy tales, and larger-than-life personalities like Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg. Throughout it all, we embody the faceless avatar of a father desperately trying to save his daughter from the clutches of an ancient pseudo-religious scientific bureaucracy. In the end, that's what tends to unite the franchise. Not gameplay mechanics, not characters, not even zombies, though those always wriggle their way in. It's that bureaucratic turn, that desire for conspiracy, that need to put the action into a globally significant military, pharmaceutical, multinational, corporate context. Village, in the end, is no different, but that still isn't the story the game wants to tell. Resident Evil Village has something new to say within that worn-out frame. As the sequel to an entire lifetime's worth of survival horror action games, Village stakes its themes and meaning on the oldest and most original creator of sequels, mothers and fathers, whose children carry on the same burden of the sequel, needing to be more of the same, but also adapting, changing with the times. It's evolution in action. Village's main character is a father seeking to piece back together his daughter so she might live on as his successful sequel, and its primary antagonist is a mother who wants to piece back her long-gone daughter and recover the sequel that never was. It struggles, as a child itself, to figure out what it wants to be, but in the process becomes a uniquely insightful game about the psychological horrors of parenthood. As we dive into the 6 sections of this new Resident Evil game, its introduction, ending, and 4 major sections in between, each with their own unique flavors, we will uncover what this game wants to say on its own matter of being a sequel, and its creator's thoughts on fatherhood. So now is finally the moment you've been waiting for. Let's talk about Resident Evil Village. Before we dive into Village, I'd like to remind you that you can take breaks during this video. Think of it more as a mini-series than necessarily a 3-hour-long movie or something like that. So if you want to watch in 3 hours, I'm not going to stop you. Though, if you do take a break, please come back. I've worked really hard on this, and I think it's just going to get more interesting from here on out. I planned a couple interludes where we can talk about some things that maybe didn't make it into the full video proper. One aspect of Resident Evil as a whole that I find pretty interesting is the schlocky writing that kind of pervades the entire series. It tends to undermine the opulent and lush atmosphere these games try to cultivate. It just feels like there isn't as much attention to detail paid to the writing, or that if there is attention to detail paid to the writing, it's not very well thought out. It's almost always cheesy, like Barry in Resident Evil 1 telling Jill, "Oh, you were almost a Jill sandwich," or Ashley at the end of Resident Evil 4 saying something along the lines of like, "Hey, let's do some overtime." It's just cheesy, and it kind of makes the whole experience a little bit lighter, which is, I guess, good for a horror game to some degree, right? To kind of give it some levity. But this is the kind of levity that, for me at least, kind of takes me out of the experience. Feels like the designers of the games are definitely aware of this problem, I guess we might be able to call it. And they're self-reflective in a lot of the games, where they make fun of their own bad writing. And, well, the question I have then is why? What does it accomplish, really, to have this? I've given one possible explanation. In general, I kind of just let it bounce off me, but I really would like to hear what you have to think about it. Do you like the writing in these games? Does it draw you in? Is it something that interests you? Or is it something that kind of pulls you off the game? Especially if you like the bad dialogue in these Resident Evil games, sound off in the comments below. Tell me why you like it. What do you find interesting about it? And don't forget to drink plenty of water as you continue our deep dive into Resident Evil Village. The Village section of Resident Evil Village is one of the most sporadic and unfocused parts of the game. The player leaps through 4 different subsections: Ethan's domestic life, a violent adventure into the village, meeting the villagers left after the chaos, and finally, a meeting with the game's villains. The beginning of most games and media is where the creators have the most creative license to do new things, and the opening section of Resident Evil Village hints to us that this game doesn't fully know what it wants to be, that it's caught between the past and future of the franchise. Each of the vignettes gives us a taste of this confusion while setting up the theme of fathers and daughters that will run throughout the game. Unlike any other game in the series, Resident Evil Village begins with a frame narrative, and it feels almost out of place given the game's genre. It's a storybook tale of a daughter getting lost while picking berries for her hard-at-work father. That father will be important later. She gets gifts of aid from a bat, skeleton, fish, and horse, but they all turn out to be an evil witch in disguise, who then banishes the girl to a mirror. Though, before the player can acclimate themselves to this story, they are ripped from it into the quiet domesticity of Ethan and Mia Winter's home. This story bears more scrutiny, but until we get it in full at the end of the game, it foreshadows the boss monsters Ethan will face throughout his journey, all of whom are introduced at the end of the village section. The bat who gives its blood, the eternal symbol of the vampire, is Lady Dimitrescu, everyone's favorite 9-foot-tall MILF. The Dark Weaver is evocative of Beneviento and her doll. Both have puppet-like qualities. Moreau is a fish, so he's the fish. Finally, the mechanical steed represents Heisenberg, who is primarily fixated on industry, metal, and mechanics. The allegory is thin and doesn't take too much mental effort to unpack. But what is interesting is that in the story, all of these lieutenants are but a ruse for the evil witch, who was each of them in disguise. While most of the discussions around Village have revolved around its minor villains, the game is letting us know up front, if we're paying attention, that this is a game about Mother Miranda, not them. They are all just shades of her, and when we understand that, we can start to piece together how the game feels about mothers and fathers. The fairy tale, Village of Shadows, supposedly a local yarn in the Eastern European setting, is clearly evocative of the terrifying tales of the Brothers Grimm. In the folklore they recorded, children typically find themselves in dangerous situations, sometimes leading to death. Yet, as a frame for the narrative of the game, the subject is strange to say the least. As we will soon come to learn, Rose has been split up between the monsters, and it's Ethan's job to save them. He is completely absent from this frame tale, a subconscious fear we will revisit in parts 6 and 7 of this long review. Frame tales are often used as reflections of the narratives they surround, and the Village of Shadows story is no different. Most importantly, this implies that Ethan Winters' story is some kind of fairy tale. This is a horror game, certainly not clean and sanitized like we expect a fairy tale to be, but this isn't a story for children. The primary aspect of the fairy tale that the game borrows is the otherworldliness of its setting, which is unique even by Resident Evil standards. Jack Zipes, author of Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion, explains that in traditional fairy tales,
despite magical transformation, there is no mention of another world. Only one side of the characters and living conditions is described. Everything is confined to a realm without morals, where class and power determine power relations. Hence, the magic and miraculous serve to rupture the feudal confines and represent metaphorically the conscious and unconscious desires of the lower classes to seize power. In the process, power takes on a moral quality.
As a series dominated by depictions of corporate power, this is not particularly new to Resident Evil, but takes on a whole new meaning when put into the context of the family drama that is Village. Ethan enters into a place that is still very much a part of the bizarre conspiracy zombie planet that houses Raccoon City and El Pueblo, but more so than Claire Redfield or Leannis Kennedy, Ethan has an opportunity to radically change this world. His miraculous power is the player's control over and identification with him. Moreover, it's hard to say that there are any morals placed on this setting. That is, other than the ones Ethan brings with him as a father trying to understand his role and receive redemption for his past sins. Returning to the story, besides being an allegory for Rose herself, is not the girl in this narrative a bit like Resident Evil Village itself? We've already discussed how children are sequels to their parents, and Village, due to its precarious situation as a follow-up to Biohazard, is lost without a clear lineage, so it wanders around, borrowing what it can from whoever will give to it. Whether that be the mythology of vampires, Chucky, the creature from the Black Lagoon, or industrial body horror. We can see the fingerprints of other Resident Evil games all over Resident Evil Village. All before finally returning to something classic, and true to the series, the biological horror of its witch, Mother Miranda. As much as Village is a game about parenthood, it's a game about figuring out what the franchise is, and it explores some fertile fears before settling in on an old classic. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Whereas Biohazard begins with Ethan Winters on the road toward a terrible adventure, Village begins in a peaceful home. We listen to our wife tell the aforementioned fairy tale to our 6-month-old daughter, Rose. The first and only action the player takes here is to put Rose to bed. Ethan dotingly says, "Daddy won't let those weird fairy tale monsters get you," which we all know is exactly what's about to happen. This home section is just enough of an idyllic existence to make it resemble some kind of status quo for Ethan and the player before thrusting them into the meat grinder. And the meat grinder it is. Within minutes of starting the game, Ethan witnesses his wife brutally murdered, not by some zombies or villains, but from his supposed friend and Resident Evil mainstay, Chris Redfield. They knock Ethan out and take his daughter without any explanation. This is, unfortunately, one of Village's weakest moments. The player and main character are left grasping at straws as to why this is happening to them. It simply doesn't make sense and falls into the classic romantic comedy trope of, if they just talked about it, maybe they could sort it out. Instead, this inciting incident hangs onto the narrative for only that reason. It allows the rest of the plot to happen. But did it have to happen like this? I kind of doubt it. Would the player have been less motivated if their child had been simply snatched away by a thief in the night like Lady Dimitrescu or Mother Miranda? Instead, this convoluted beginning serves to entrench the player in that classic Resident Evil feeling, bewildered confusion at a needlessly complicated plot. It's so over the top that one of Chris's team reprimands him later, saying, "You should have told him the truth." Still, I just want to note that this game is more interesting than its most boneheaded moments. We don't have much time to dwell on things. Ethan wakes up to the sight of a car crash, with only one way to move forward, toward the eponymous village. The game deliberately sets up the village as entering a new world, a fairy tale set aside from reality. Ethan begins the trek at night in near pitch black, and after entering a house not unlike Hansel and Gretel or Little Red Riding Hood, emerges from its basement after a big ruckus and finds it daytime, with an ominous castle off in the distance. Ethan has descended, not just into the horror of the village, but into his own subconscious fears. After this, Ethan journeys into the heart of the town, where we get some equipment and lose some fingers. We start to wrap our heads around the present danger. Ethan then relives the same nightmare that halted me from playing Resident Evil 4 for months, an entire village of zombified adversaries on the hunt that he must outwit and outmaneuver. But while this section attempts to hit the tone of Resident Evil 4's village section, matching it beat for beat down to the zombies being called off at the last second, it doesn't quite frighten the player in the same way. The villagers of 4 are unsettling because they act like normal people before Leon walks into town. It is only once they notice him that everything turns sour. When their true nature is revealed, it's spooky, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Meanwhile, the Lycans of Resident Evil Village are certainly a frightening enemy from a gameplay perspective, and the game offers some potently scary moments. I almost leapt out of my seat when they came through the roof to get at me at one point. But they don't stick with you in the same way because, ultimately, they are just fast, militarized zombies. They don't have much of a personality other than being killing machines, and they never present as anything more than that. Both scenes end as a bell is rung deeper within the village, attracting the attention of our adversaries as they mysteriously leave. In RE4, this is internally consistent with the villagers we saw before the sequence, who seemed relatively amicable, almost like they were brainwashed. In Village, the same move doesn't feel as intuitive, since the Lycans seem single-minded, focused on slaughter and not much else. I bring up this connection because right here, this village, this moment, is one of the primary selling points of the entire game. Capcom wants you to be thinking about Resident Evil 4 when you're playing this game. In theory, this bodes well for RE8. It's taking after most people's favorite Resident Evil game. It may also bode terribly for whatever comes next, because Resident Evil 4 is where the series started to take a nosedive. Still, we're here to talk about Village, and Resident Evil 9, or 10, or whatever's coming next, is not out, so let's finally meet some named characters. That's right, after Mia got shot up, the only voice to listen to for this entire extended sequence is that of Ethan Winters, the protagonist whose lack of character is one of his strongest selling points. Sure, Ethan does occasionally react to the world around him, but doesn't do much else. Up until this point, we've been like Claire Redfield, journeying into Raccoon City in Resident Evil 2, moving into a surreal and terrifying world with only some semblance of a goal. It isn't until we meet other survivors that the game is going to start directing us. This is one continuation of Biohazard. Whereas past Resident Evil games had a colorful cast of allied characters to bounce ideas off of, both of the first-person games scale back the amount of interactions you have with NPCs who are not antagonists. In Biohazard, the only one that pops to my head is Mia herself, who turns antagonistic within moments of meeting her. There are some others, I guess, now that I'm actually saying this out loud, but whatever. In Village, we pretty much only have this section at Louisa's house. But what the game sacrifices in width, it makes up for in depth. If you're reading a story and something is only mentioned once, it might be a mirage, something not that important. The moment it comes up again, that's where we've got to start wondering, is this what it's all about? At Louisa's house, we get the answer as to what Resident Evil Village actually cares about: parents. As the player moseys on through the now mostly Lycan-free village, they talk to a fun old lady, witness Mother Miranda kill a villager, and meet Leonardo and Elena, a father-daughter combo of survivors. Leonardo, injured in the Lycan attacks, is pinned down outside of Louisa's gate. He is distrustful of Ethan, but Elena knows he's pretty much their only hope. After some spatial puzzle solving, Ethan is able to open that gate and get the pair to safety. Louisa's house is full of people, and for a moment, an experienced player might start to wonder if Louisa's will be the base of operations for the rest of the game. The group prays together, and this colorful cast of characters starts to make their introductions. We learn their names, not so much their hobbies, it's not a speed day, but whatever. This safety, though, is short-lived. Leonardo is infected. He turns into a lichen and attacks the group, making quick work of the remaining survivors in this unnamed village. Only Ethan and Elena manage to escape, but the house catches on fire, and it's only a matter of time until they are consumed in the flames. Unfortunately, because the house is boarded up to protect from outside threats, its inhabitants are not prepared for an internal one like a lichen father or fire. Ethan and Elena make their way up to the attic to find a way out. For a moment, it feels like, sure, okay, this won't be our base of operations, but at least we'll have a companion in Elena. But as the pair are about to escape, Leonardo reappears and calls out for his daughter. Elena, at this point having seen literally every person in her village, perhaps everyone she's ever known die, runs back to her father. The house begins to collapse. Ethan tries to save her, but she tells him to let go and go save his daughter, not some daughter of this forsaken village. In a game about parents and children, this early father-daughter pairing holds a mirror up to the game's thematic concerns. But what does this pair tell us about Ethan and Rose? First, that fathers have the capability to be monsters, to devour their daughters if they are not careful. Beneath his rough exterior, Leonardo no doubt deeply cares for Elena, but his inability or unwillingness to consider that he might be a threat is what ultimately costs both him, his daughter, and everyone at Louisa's respite their lives. Just as importantly, this tragic story points to the loyalty of children. Despite Ethan pleading with her to join him, to be the Ashley of Resident Evil Village, she rejects the author, choosing to die with her father rather than go on. Elena won't be the last child in this game to have undying devotion to their parents, a level of devotion only matched by other parent characters. Thus, Ethan learns in the closing moments before the narrative proper begins of the danger he poses with the power of being a parent. He commands the child's devotion to him. He has the capacity to destroy them entirely. Elena's words, "Go save your daughter," ring true not just as the motivation to keep moving forward through the narrative, but as a warning call. She basically says, "I am what happens if you don't." This foreshadows the end of the game, where Ethan must confront his own inner monstrosity in order to save Rose. More on that later. Despite Elena's words of encouragement, the village section ends not with Ethan triumphantly entering Castle Dimitrescu, ready to get his daughter back, but with him realizing just how far he's got to go in order to save her. As he starts his way up the mountain to the castle, he is captured by Heisenberg, a man with a magnetic personality. In this interim cutscene, we see the fairy tale come to life, its characters flesh and blood rather than pen and paper. They are not here to give gifts, rather split the daughter into pieces. Ethan is not a hero, but tossed about as a plaything for these villains until Heisenberg is granted the toy, much to Dimitrescu's chagrin. He sends Ethan into a terrifying game deep below, but this game pales in comparison to the quadruple threat posed by Mother Miranda's lords, each of whom represents a different fear for the potential parent. Ethan makes short work of Heisenberg's challenge and makes his way up to the castle to finally meet the lady we've all been dying to talk about. Each of Resident Evil Village's 4 major villains key at least a bit off the classic Universal movie monsters. Lady Dimitrescu is naturally Dracula. We can see this in her penchant for sucking blood, her giant gothic castle, and the way her children turn into bats. And most importantly, her erotic aura. You see, the vampire is inherently a symbol of untamed sexuality. The blood-sucking creature embodies both the fear of and desire for voracious, sensual encounters. So, is it really any surprise that when audiences got their first taste of Resident Evil Village, they went a little gaga over Lady Dimitrescu? In this section, we're going to discuss the history of the vampire seductress, how audiences played into that trope by hypersexualizing our 9-foot-tall pale mistress, and the much more human version of the character we actually find within the game. Ultimately finding a common fear, that of intimacy, vulnerability, and sex. The earliest literary accounts of vampires place the vampiress as a sexual creature. Shared in Le Fanu's 1872 novella Carmilla is centered around a lesbian-coded vampire who preys on innocent Laura, the book's protagonist. In contrast between Carmilla, a dangerous and sexually transgressive, blood-sucking woman who is secretly centuries old, and Laura, the prototypical pure virgin who may or may not be seduced into breaking sexual norms, is a great framing tool for understanding the historical context of the feminine vampire. Either they are already corrupted and dangerous, or imminently corruptible and must be protected. Figuring importantly into Carmilla's narrative is the sexual coming of age in women signaled by menstruation. In her discussion of the novel, Laura Grenfell argues,
"The crossroads of blood, the female body, murder, and procreation represent the main symbolic elements of the late 19th century Gothic vampire narrative. A narrative which arguably embodies male fear and anxiety regarding the unrepresentable, the uncontainable, and the unknowable. Menstrual blood."
The vampiress is thus a threat, whether in regards to fears of bodily fluids or the sexual empowerment of women. She disrupts the status quo of patriarchal power, and as showed by the end of Carmilla, where Laura remains infected. Long after the vampire's demise, that disruption lives far beyond the life of the sexual transgressor. As we dive into understanding the allure of Lady Dimitrescu, it's important to understand her earliest literary comparison might well be Carmilla, who likewise battles a man looking to avenge his daughter. You are probably more familiar with Dracula than Carmilla, but did you know that Bram Stoker's book was published 25 years after Le Fanu's novel? Many consider Dracula a response to the then popular Carmilla. Grenfell argues that Stoker fixes the story by asserting masculine control at the end of the narrative as opposed to the more open-ended conclusion of Carmilla. This is important as we approach Resident Evil Village, because if we understand that the vampire is a distinctly feminine creature, then Lady Dimitrescu has a specific literary heritage we can draw from to understand her place in this narrative about fathers and daughters. Even if Stoker did not invent the vampire or the vampire novel, he certainly popularized it. Village is clearly inspired by the tale. In the original story, Dracula lives in a large castle in Eastern Europe with a harem of 3 vampire brides, and it begins when a lone man enters their abode. In Village, a lone man enters Castle Dimitrescu and must contend with a vampire and her 3 daughters, who, like Dracula's brides, treat him as a sexual and culinary object for their pleasure. As we will explore further in this section, that shift from husband and bride to mother and daughter for these villains is significant to the themes of parenthood Village explores. The modern vampire lives in the shadow of Dracula. The mythos established in that tale influences deeply everything from Twilight to Buffy to what we do in the shadows. The modern feminine vampire is a complicated creature. Amanda Hobson, in her book chapter titled Dark Seductress, The Hypersexualization of the Female Vampire, writes,
"Our visual culture emphasizes the voracious sexuality of the female body, and more so of the female vampiric body. The vampire seductress fills our imagination as she embodies contradicting ideals of femininity, such as fragility, strength, beauty, and power.
Likewise, Lady Dimitrescu embodies conflicting parts of femininity. On one hand, she desires to present herself as a lady, one with poise and manners. While her daughters wear bloody robes and need a good face cleanse, Dimitrescu is the definition of prim and proper. Yet, she is 9 feet tall, a terrifying presence who needs to duck under doors in order to move around her own home. She is powerful, particularly in an emotional sense, more imposing than any other enemy in the game. Most importantly, the modern vampiress embodies fears around feminine sexuality. Hobson argues,
The female vampire in contemporary media relies heavily upon the fear of women's sexuality, the ability to contain a woman's desire once it is released, and the belief that that unbridled and voracious female sexual desire will upend stable gender and, in turn, cultural norms.
fears around sexual pleasure and desire are different than, say, that of a bat or spider, though. They need to be culturally constructed in order to function, whereas a fear of heights or snakes are at least partially a survival response to a potentially deadly situation. This contradiction, fearing what we want, is a key component of Gothic literature. Jack Halberstam writes,
The Gothic inspires fear and desire at the same time. Fear of and desire for the other. Fear of and desire for the possibly latent perversity lurking within the reader herself.
In other words, it's psychological. The feminine vampire holds a mirror up to ourselves and says, "See that desire within you? Isn't it scary?" Whether the audience is masculine and thus afraid of how the female vampire might castrate them, or they are feminine and afraid of their own sexual desires, the female vampire poses a threat to the status quo. It is these conflicting feelings that fear and desire potently mixed together that made Lady Dimitrescu the object of so much attention in the months leading up to Resident Evil Village's release. Not just the fact that she was sexually attractive, though she was. It is productive, before going further, especially considering the lesbian undertones of both Dimitrescu's castle and Carmilla, to consider the playable demo released to promote the game, Maiden. In Maiden, the player controls a woman who has been kidnapped and imprisoned within the dungeon of Castle Dimitrescu. The plot is sparse. You escape your cell and explore the castle looking for a way out. If it wasn't for the eerie feeling that you could be caught at any moment, it would mostly serve as a technical demo of the beauty of Ari Village's graphics. But as you explore, Dimitrescu's daughter Cassandra pursues you, and, right on the verge of freedom, Dimitrescu herself catches and guts you, all while keeping her polite exterior. Dimitrescu is only present for the last moments of the demo, but she left a lasting impression on those who played it and those who didn't. Still, I'd like to focus on the titular maiden of this story. She is not Ethan Winters. She has no weapons to fight back with. She comes across as pure heroine, not unlike Carmilla's Laura. Cassandra and her sisters, like Carmilla, are particularly interested in consuming female flesh. In the castle, there is little to no evidence of men, whether as perpetrators of violence or victims of the vampiress's feeding. In the castle's dungeons, the maiden finds letters between other maidens, no men. And the castle's famous wine, Sanguis Virginis, literally means maiden's blood. This is a feminine space, albeit one with copious amounts of woman-on-woman violence. This commitment to a feminine vampire aesthetic in both hunter and prey directly evokes the history of Carmilla, who likewise preyed upon maidens, women who had come of age but had not yet wed. Whereas Laura, a character whose name is deliberately obscured in Carmilla's narrative so as to come across as every woman physically, escapes the clutches of the vampiress, but is irrevocably changed for the experience. The maiden, a different every woman, does not escape and succumbs to the carnal pleasures of female vampires. And, just like Carmilla, it takes the strength of a man, I guess, to topple the danger posed by the vampire seductress in Resident Evil Village. As for Dimitrescu, her larger-than-life physical form and persona took on a life of its own on social media. For months, I saw people on Twitter begging Mommy Vampire to step on them. She was a sexual force to be reckoned with, part vampire fetish, part dom fetish, part horror fetish. Something for everyone, I suppose. Yet, while her dramatic presentation was new to most of us, Village's creative team drew from some non-vampiric cultural legacies in her construction. Closest to home, for the directors that is, was how her visual design leaned on the Japanese urban legend of the Hashaku-sama. To be honest, I can't pronounce Japanese words quite that well, so rather than make a fool of myself, I'm simply going to call this creature Hachi. Hachi should feel familiar when I describe her to you. She is an 8 feet tall spirit wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a white sundress. She imitates the voices of relatives to lure young men and relatives to an early demise, and when she gets a mark, she pursues them forever. The original creepypasta that brought Hachi to us tells the story of a young man who has a chance meeting with an impossibly tall woman while visiting his grandparents. He tells his family of this, and they hastily make preparations to protect him, setting him up in a room with newspapers on the window and filled with Buddhist talismans. They warn the boy to not leave the room or open the door until morning, and that none of them will call him during the night. Yet, he wakes up and hears the voice of his grandfather outside his room, beckoning him to leave. When he refuses, he hears the low voice of the spirit laughing, po, 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 and tapping on his window with her long fingers. He survives the night by praying to Buddha, while the salt left in each corner of the room turns black from Hachi's presence. His family concocts a convoluted plan to confuse the spirit so she can't track him. He escapes and arrives back at home, never to visit his grandparents again. Years later, he receives a phone call from his grandmother who asks him to come home. He asks, "What about Hachi?" After a pause, he hears on the other end of the line that devious laugh. Po, 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 po. Spooky stuff, huh? The inspiration on Lady Dimitrescu is pretty clear. She looks almost exactly like the urban legend describes, from the tall stature to the apparel choices, and both pursue their play with a relentless and ravenous energy. A vaguely sexual energy exudes from each, whether in Hachi's pursuit of a young man on the verge of manhood and trying to invade his room in the dead of night, or in the way Lady Dimitrescu yearns to devour Ethan Winters with vampiric lust. Lady Dimitrescu's character also draws from a real-life figure, Elizabeth Bathory, a 17th century Hungarian woman who is considered one of the most prolific female mass murderers in history. While discerning truth from fiction regarding Bathory's story is difficult, the legend is what matters for its influence on the fictional story of Village. It is said that Bathory bathed in the blood of virgins, a nod to which can be found in Lady Dimitrescu's castle. Most of her victims were young women or maidens, and she was cooped up in a castle for the rest of her life after being convicted of her crimes. Considering that Dimitrescu barely leaves her castle either, there is a clear connection. This isn't revolutionary stuff. The director of the game has said as much, but the Bathory and Hachi connections help us understand that Village's portrayal of Lady Dimitrescu is a distinctly feminine kind of horror. Tomonori Takano, the game's art director, says as much in an interview with IGN.
All the enemy types inside the castle are female. With Lady Dimitrescu as the cult's guru, we have created this hierarchy of women. Men have their blood drained by these women, so you could say it's the opposite of Dracula.
Originally, they thought to populate the castle with 100 nude witches. which proved too difficult from a game design decision, oh well. But all this focus on the feminine, especially considering that the main character of the game is a man invading this space, points to the real fear on display in Castle Dimitrescu. Sex. What do we mean by sex in this context, though? One of my favorite ways to define sex is through the Hebrew word yada, which is the word used to describe when Adam and Eve first had a sexual encounter in the Torah. Yada does not simply mean intercourse, but to know, to be known, and to be respected. So, specifically, the fear of sex in this instance is the fear of intimacy, of closeness. Plenty of textual evidence reinforces that Ethan fears intimacy. First of all, we have cause. When he went to rescue Mia in Biohazard, she was normal for a bit, and then turned into a monster who attacked him. The two got into what can only be described as a harrowing bout of domestic violence, where Ethan has to kill Mia in order to survive. When I played Biohazard, it was probably this moment that stuck with me the most, that felt the most real, visceral. And while Ethan cures Mia in the end, you would probably be pretty terrified of getting close to someone after going through that, wouldn't you? We can find this fear on display in the opening moments of the game, where Ethan disrupts an intimate moment of storytelling between mother and daughter because he finds the story too spooky, and in a flashback where Mia tells Ethan they hardly talk about anything other than Rose. It's clear their relationship lacks intimacy. Ethan fears getting close to other, a fear that is reaffirmed when Chris Redfield, his buddy, shows up at his house uninvited and offs his wife without so much as a word as to why. This relates to parenthood in two ways. One, intimacy is physically required to make children. And two, to raise a child well, a parent needs to be close to them. Ethan can't be a good husband or a good father without learning to open up more and let others in. And in Castle Dimitrescu, he has to confront that fear through its countess. Dimitrescu represents intimacy gone wrong, closeness that ends not with both partners feeling enriched, but one sucking the life out of the other, violently using their partner for their own pleasure and sustenance without giving anything back. We've discussed at length how Dimitrescu's visual design pushes towards a sense of violent feminine sexuality, but the way she is ludically designed reinforces that fear as well. For the most part, Lady Dimitrescu is the only enemy in the game that follows the Mr. X/Nemesis formula from the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. This is a nearly unkillable foe who tracks the player through an area. When this monster shows up, all the player can do, really, is flee. Think about it. Whenever the most feminine and sexualized character in the entire game shows up, the player has to get out of dodge. Doesn't that strike you as maybe just a little bit odd? Ethan has face-to-face conversations with every other major boss, but Dimitrescu, the game's symbol of sex and intimacy, only tortures and attacks Ethan when close. The player has to enact Ethan's fear of closeness every time they see Dimitrescu, or else get a game over. She stalks the castle, showing up at inopportune times, forcing them to change their plans and get away from her. Thus, Ethan spends almost the entirety of the section avoiding her, specifically trying not to get close. Almost paradoxically, it is in this context of the fear the castle and its countess represent that the game gives us its most potent scene of intimacy at all. In it, Ethan voyeuristically peers through a window to get a glimpse of the alluring Lady Dimitrescu without her knowledge. You don't have to be an expert in the male gaze to see the subtext to the scene. But rather than witnessing her undress for our sexual pleasure, the game surprises us by giving the opportunity to empathize, to know and understand the towering 9-foot-tall vampire. To set the scene, Ethan has just killed one of Lady Dimitrescu's daughters. Dimitrescu talks to Mother Miranda on the phone. She tells her that Ethan has escaped Heisenberg's game and is too much for her daughters to handle. While putting on lipstick and looking in the mirror. Interesting that they placed a vanity in the scene, since traditionally, vampires don't even have reflections. Dimitrescu wants to kill Ethan, but Mother Miranda rebukes her, remarking on some important ceremony that is yet to come. A sense of distress hangs over her face as she politely complies. That is, until she angrily hangs up the phone and throws the vanity across the room, destroying it. All of her beauty means nothing in light of the loss of her daughter. Dimitrescu's poised exterior is broken here. She is vulnerable and open. In this moment, Ethan and Dimitrescu have something in common. They both want to protect their children. This is one of the few moments where a villain in the game truly comes across as relatable. Of course, even that intimacy is one-sided, and in mere moments, she will be slamming Ethan's face into the floor, telling him to keep his hands off her daughters, another sexually charged phrase. Later, she will slice off Ethan's hand so he can't even be intimate with himself. So, we have an intimate moment with Lady Dimitrescu, and we have this fear of sex and intimacy running throughout the entire castle, one punctuated by collecting faces off of nude statues and a puzzle where fair virgins avert their gazes from nearby men. How then does Ethan conquer this fear of intimacy? In classic Resident Evil fashion, through gratuitous violence. Fortunately, a boss fight is a kind of intimacy, a dance between two characters as they vie for supremacy. For its part, Lady Dimitrescu's boss fight leans into this intimacy rather than tearing from it. It begins with Ethan stabbing Dimitrescu in the heart with a ceremonial dagger, making her finally vulnerable to his arsenal of firearms. Pity. She and he are both exposed, and thus true intimacy between the pair can begin. Dimitrescu notices this, and as she turns into a monster, she tells the player, "You're a lucky man, Ethan. Besides Miranda, you're the only one to ever see me in this form." Here she is in front of you, denuded, remarking that in some freakish way, this is you two knowing each other in a way she can only compare to her surrogate mother. What truly connects these characters, though, is loss. Ethan has lost his wife and is trying to reclaim his daughter, while Dimitrescu has lost her 3 children. The irony of this predicament is not lost on her, as she remarks, "How dare you talk about saving your daughter when you've murdered mine?" Though she keeps out the fact that she locked him in her castle and has a piece of his daughter on her person, or that Ethan was acting in self-defense and her daughters were the one who hunted him down. But I digress. As the fight wanes on, it is hard not to see more similarities between the participants than differences. The game's director, Morimasa Sato, agrees. In an interview, he explains,
Ethan has a family he is trying to protect, so we wanted to have a family for Lady Dimitrescu as well, to provide contrast.
But while Sato sets them against each other, it's hard not to find them fighting for the same thing. And it is in that act of fighting for his family that Ethan can prepare for fatherhood. As she becomes more monstrous, Ethan is forced to look at and interact with her in a way that the game had previously forbade due to Dimitrescu's impenetrable exterior. The two reenact some sort of devious and wrong sexual act, with each phase of the fight bringing them closer together until they fall from a tall height, clutching one another. Dimitrescu dies, but not before telling Ethan to succumb to his own despair. For his trouble, Ethan receives a crystal statue resembling her sexualized torso, a token of his once powerful phobia, now made inert. He also receives part of his daughter, symbolizing that he is one step closer to parenthood after conquering his fear of intimacy. But, as we both know, Ethan has more fears to work through until he's ready to tango with the game's real matron, Mother Miranda. What? Were you expecting someone else? If the first boss of Resident Evil represents the fear of intimacy, its second lord, Donna Beneviento, investigates the consequences of intimacy, pregnancy. Rather than the towering, impersonal castle of Lady Dimitrescu, Ethan finds himself in an uncomfortably simple home. Recall that the last 2 times Ethan was in this kind of space, he witnessed a female partner, whether his wife or Elena, die. At this point, the domestic home should be a severe warning sign to the player as to what is to come. And true to form, House Beneviento is one of the most terrifying sections of the game. Like each of the lords, we were first introduced to Beneviento at the end of the village section, though it is not Donna we become acquainted with, but her doll, Angie. While Dimitrescu's voice is the first we hear at the family meeting, it is Angie that we first see. Her voice is distinctly not present, filtered through what sounds like an intercom, and as we watch Angie hop into Beneviento's lap, we know some amount of puppeteering is going on here. Unlike Dimitrescu or Heisenberg, who argue over who is the child and adult between them, Angie relishes in her childlike appearance, imploring the two to fight, 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 and containing an unbound enthusiasm for the gruesome fate of Ethan. Through Angie, Beneviento prefers to play the subtle puppet master in the corner rather than present herself as large and powerful like the brutish Heisenberg, and her section of the game reflects this by being less about thrilling action and more about the nuances of the human mind. The doll, or puppet, has been a mainstay in the Western popular conscience for decades. One of the first films to explore the psychology of the ventriloquist was the 1929 musical, The Great Gabbo. The film follows the story of the amazing ventriloquist Gabbo, a man who can only express himself through his puppet, and whose personal life falters as a result. He eventually suffers a mental breakdown and loses all of his success because he cannot exist outside of his puppet. Hans Strauss argues,
the character of the puppet master is unable to exist as a singular identity, and turns to the child-sized puppet in order to exist as a coherent self.
Likewise, it is impossible to separate Beneviento's identity from Angie. Internal game documents state that Beneviento is mentally underdeveloped, unable or unwilling to mature, instead choosing to play with dolls she can animate with her zombie magic. Watching a puppeteer profoundly disassociate from themselves while interacting with the world is strangely gripping. Characters like the Great Gabbo and Beneviento use the puppet to revert to an id-like existence, devoid of any ego or superego. But they do not simply reject social norms or rationality or revert to an animal state. They twist civilization in a deviously mature way under the guise of being a child. The contemporary horror doll tends to eschew the relationship between puppet and puppet master. While Chucky, the villain of the Child's Play series, was originally a serial killer whose mind got transported into that of a doll, at least kind of hinting at a relationship between human and doll, in the recent reboot he's just a rogue AI controlling a toy. Meanwhile, Annabelle, another popular horror doll, is controlled by a demonic being rather than an actual person. I think something's lost when these films use the imagery of the terrifying toy but attribute its evil to something beyond human. The menacing puppet is intriguing because it holds a mirror up to us. As Strauss writes,
the devil doll, as doppelganger, is an atavistic figure. Horrifying because it is the uncontrolled and irrational other, a primal figure that defies normality, rationality, and civilization.
In other words, the puppet shows us what we may well be like if we took off our own masks, if we weren't bound up in maintaining a social self. This truth is best relayed through someone putting on the mask of a child, because children themselves do not have fully realized social identities. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we don't live in a world with actual killer dolls. no matter how convincing Tom Hanks is in Toy Story. So, when we remove the human component of horror dolls, they lose their psychological potency and become inert as vessels of meaning. Fortunately, Resident Evil Village sidesteps this mistake. Beneviento is not only a deranged woman controlling a puppet, but interrogates Ethan's fear of tackling fatherhood alone. Her section of the game is the only one to meaningfully engage with Ethan's relationship with his dead wife. Unlike Dimitrescu, whose feminine sexuality is lavish and abundant, so much so that her presence is overwhelming in every room she walks into, Beneviento points to female erasure. This is most obvious in her choice of apparel, as she wears a dress and veil common to the hidden mother genre of photography. For those unfamiliar, early cameras needed much longer exposure to capture an image than today's, and people wanted to take pictures of their children, but the damn kids wouldn't sit still for how long it took to take a photograph. The solution was to put the tyke on mommy's lap, where they'd calm down for a bit. But what's this? We don't want mom in the photo, so let's just throw a blanket over her head and keep the focus on what matters, the toddler. Damn. So, no, it's okay. The toddler currently pooping their pants. The reasons for this aren't exactly known. At least according to the sources I could scrounge up, some say mothers did not view themselves as worthy of taking a picture of. Others say that the mothers wanted the picture to be between the child and the viewer, not highlight the relationship between mother and child. Regardless of the exact intention, looking at these photos today is eerie. A spooky, occult-like energy comes off the images. It's easy to see why Village's art team would be so drawn to recreating the hidden mother look from an aesthetic purpose, but as potently, Beneviento's unassuming black garb points to Rose's hidden mother, whose absence is the inciting incident in Village's narrative. In Beneviento, Ethan has to contend with the glaring hole in his life, his mute, blind, and invisible wife, Mia. Beneviento is the reality of his wife's erasure, but she hides behind the mask of Angie. Quite fittingly then, Angie wears a wedding dress, as she is a flamboyant voice of the hidden mother, wearing that which is meant to attract attention rather than avoid it. If Beneviento represents the reality of Mia's absence, then Angie illustrates just how the memory of that absence torments Ethan. It prods at him, reminds him of his commitment to his family, of the partner who was there to co-parent with him, but is now as stiff as the doll representing her. Angie is purposely annoying and off-putting, not quite scary, because her goal is always to keep Ethan's attention on the pain of Mia's death, because it stops him from working through his grief. As for Beneviento herself, she desires to work through her own grief by trapping Ethan, as she has taken to thinking of herself as a potential surrogate mother for Rose, a replacement for Mia, though that evidence comes right at the tail end of this section. So, before getting to it, let's go back to the beginning. As he ventures from the ritual site toward House Beneviento, Ethan encounters visions of his wife. She implores him to push forward, that she has something she wants to tell him. There's something wrong with Rose, and he needs to fix her. In essence, Mia calls on the patriarch to make things right. Don't forget the frame tale at the start, where it is the absence of the father that causes the daughter to go missing in the first place. We will later learn that Beneviento is a master of illusions and hallucinations, making clear that this isn't the ghost of Mia talking to Ethan, but Ethan's subconscious idea of her reaching out to influence him. Like Beneviento hides behind Angie, Mia's absence and Ethan's grief hide behind the most salient terror of House Beneviento, Ethan's fear of pregnancy and family. From the game's outset, Ethan keeps a picture of his beautiful wife and daughter in his inventory. Every time he is caused to use a key item, he is forced to see the picture, a reminder both of what he has lost and what he is fighting for. After seeing a Beneviento grave, that of a child no less, Ethan gives up this photograph as ticket for entry into her home. in essence, release a vision of his past for a chance to get a grip on his future. While every section of the game deals with aspects of fatherhood, from sex to workaholism, it is here where the unit of the nuclear family comes into full view, tempting and haunting Ethan. As he enters the house, he finds it empty. There's furniture, bedrooms and photographs, a pleasant space of placid domesticity. There's nothing to fear here except the fact that we have been conditioned to be wary of this kind of space. So, we enter each room with suspicion, waiting for Angie or a lichen to leap out at us from a corner. Yet, none do. This place is as safe as the opening section with Mia, though we all know how that turned out. Eventually, the player finds an elevator, one which does not simply change elevation, but what level of Ethan's consciousness we experience. This basement is initially as calm as the rooms upstairs, but its red walls and labyrinthine structure immediately put me on edge. As Ethan explores, he finds another piece of rose, sitting in little Angie's lap on a room with hanging mannequin pieces from the ceiling. Jackpot? Maybe? Though, as you already suspect, this is only going to get worse from here. As Ethan approaches, the lights go out and Angie speaks. I've been waiting for so long. I'd make a much better daughter than Rose. Please, won't you stay with me forever? When we remember that Angie is only the disembodied voice of Beneviento, we finally start to get a picture of our goal. She doesn't want to kill Ethan. She wants to ensnare him in a life of domesticity, using Angie as the bait of a new child. As the lights flicker, Mia, in mannequin form, lies cold upon the table, an eerie reminder that Ethan is all alone, and of the fear he must overcome, family life without her. Ethan has a choice in House Beneviento. He can either have the nuclear family, the one he submitted when he pushed his family photo through that mail slot, this time with Beneviento's wife and Angie as child, or he can accept the truth that he'll never have a whole family again. One of these ideas is planted in his head by Beneviento. The other comes from within. Thus, we intuitively know what Ethan will choose in the end, but he must endure the horrors of House Beneviento first. And boy, is this place a doozy. As Angie disappears, so too do all of Ethan's weapons and gear. Fortunately, there won't be too many enemies to worry about down here, only the phantoms of the past. First, Ethan must perform an autopsy on his dead wife. He must literally tear her limbs off and break her down to get out of here. A macabre intimacy is on display in the scene, but most pertinently, it feels as though we're reckoning with our own role in Mia's demise. We take from this faux corpse what we can: a bloody wedding ring, a silver key, a strip of film. In essence, we loot Mia's corpse. We take what's available, physically, spiritually, to keep moving forward in the wake of death and hardship. Mia's corpse is a potent reminder of what we leave behind when we die, and how others pick up those fragments to keep pushing ahead. But it isn't just Mia's body that haunts Ethan. That corpse he watched get obliterated in a hail of gunfire. Her voice disrupts whatever tranquility there might be and hints at what Ethan is terrified of: pregnancy and change. As he unlocks a door with the key retrieved from her leg, we hear her over the radio. Whoa, that's a kick. Can you believe it? She's so energetic. It's crazy. Rose encroaches on their relationship, on this tender autopsy, a reminder of what Ethan is here to do. Continuing through the basement, Ethan replays their relationship's greatest hits, from getting married to finding out they're with child. These puzzles relate directly to being a family man, such as playing a wedding music box or arranging family photos. Mia's voice continues to haunt Ethan. As he picks up a ringing phone, she cryptically tells him she had to do it, though whatever it is never explained. Considering this is all in Ethan's head, maybe this is his subconscious Mia telling him that it isn't his fault, that he doesn't know the full context of the situation quite yet. He won't learn that until he's on death's door. Ethan descends further into madness, cutting open Mia's bandages in what, while not exactly a cesarean cut, is still evocative of one. He crawls into a well to find a crucial puzzle piece, and as he returns, the entire demeanor of the basement changes. The clear white light of the basement is replaced with an ominous blood red, and as he re-enters Mia's autopsy room, he finds the mannequin gone. But her voice, endlessly over the radio, repeats, "It'll be fine, it'll be fine, it'll be fine." Either the audio of her giving birth or having a panic attack. It's hard to tell. As Ethan ventures toward the exit, he is confronted with what he has feared all along, the child he brought into this world. An overlarge, demented fetus chases him through the hallway. Its radio-filtered voice, not unlike Mia's earlier, laughs and cries, disturbingly calling out for its parents as it crawls menacingly towards Ethan. He must avoid it or else be swallowed whole by its gaping mouth. It's one of the most terrifying representations of the fear of parenthood I've ever experienced. I just don't see how this could represent anything other than Ethan's fear of children, specifically those still in the womb. Everything leading up to the baby's presence was reenacting Mia's pregnancy, and its arrival coincides with the disappearance of his wife. The two are not able to coexist in Ethan's terrible nightmare. Tocophobia, the fear of pregnancy, is most acutely felt in women, for obvious reasons, but can also be experienced by men. One study found 11% of men with pregnant wives suffer from it, but that study is far from conclusive. The exact number is probably less significant than how the fear manifests itself in men. Whereas many tocophobic women experience internal anxiety about their personal health or that of the child they are carrying, the tocophobic man experiences fear for someone else. They are not in harm's way themselves. Thus, it is an externalized anxiety placed on the body of someone else, just like how Ethan's anxieties in House Beneviento are placed onto Mia's body. The fear becomes a reality when the child is born, a monster no less, and it consumes Mia's body with it. The bloody trail it leaves behind indicates the injury caused by its birth. Castle Dimitrescu primed Ethan to be intimate with someone, but House Beneviento shows the consequences of that intimacy and how it has the potential to destroy the family he had. Indeed, in the narrative of the game, it is Rose's birth that acts as the catalyst for Mia to be killed in front of Ethan. This is not Rose's fault, of course, but this golden child is the first domino to fall that ends up with Ethan being chased around an unfamiliar basement by a weird fetus creature. Blah. This embryonic terror is the most petrifying creature in the entire game, and proves something important for the future of the franchise. Resident Evil is at its best when it's not trying to explain everything to the audience. Ethan flees from the creature, playing the world's most dangerous game of hide and seek, eventually reaching the elevator to escape. And guess what? The baby never shows up again. It's not a boss or anything like that. It's clear blue skies from here on out. As it bangs on the elevator's protective metal grate, relief comes over both Ethan and the player. But we're not quite out of the funhouse yet. We've still got to deal with Beneviento herself. The former tranquility of the upstairs is now corrupted by a wild Angie who has filled the place with dolls. Ever hear about one duck-sized horse or 100 duck-sized horses? Well, this is kind of like that. Out of the one giant flesh fetus pan and into the hundreds of baby-sized dolls fire. Beneviento speaks her first and last words of the entire narrative as Ethan encounters all these puppets. She flashes in and begs Ethan, "Don't leave. I can't let you." She is completely bought into the fantasy of living a quiet life here with Ethan. What she sees in him we'll never fully understand. What we do understand is that our life is in peril. Whereas downstairs we played a horrifying game of hide and seek as the hider, upstairs we find ourselves the seeker, looking throughout the entire house for Angie's wedding dress amongst a sea of familiar-looking dolls. The ghostly strings of music give way to abstract crying of babies in the audio track. The metaphor is obvious. We're in a nursery, trying to find our baby, but so many children are here, we can't find her. And, let's be honest, all babies kind of do look the same, though not quite like the one downstairs. Angie taunts Ethan every time she finds him, asking if he also stabs Rose, and telling him that everything would be better if she wasn't born. As he progresses through the house, her form becomes more monstrous. She bleeds all over him. We can see a parasite beneath the porcelain breaking free until finally we kill Angie. And in a flash, the hallucination dissipates. We learn it was really Beneviento we were stabbing all along. She does leave behind Angie as a parting gift, though, for what it's worth. With Lady Dimitrescu, Ethan killed his fear of feminine sexuality. Here, he kills his fear of the baby, of raising it alone, and of the potential disruption it might cause to his wife and family. In order to do so, he had to eliminate the false option, living in hallucinations rather than reality, and choose to accept change rather than run from it. As we near the end of this section, you may be wondering, wait, I thought you said that each villain corresponds to a universal monster villain at the start of the Dimitrescu chapter. And I have not forgotten, but it is when we see the veil removed from Beneviento's head and the scarred face she hides underneath that the villain becomes obvious. It's the Phantom. You know, the one of the opera? The Phantom of the Opera is a similarly scarred character who falls in love but dies trying to imprison their potential partner. Moreover, the Phantom and Beneviento hide behind illusion, behind fiction in a metaphysical stage. They are evil figures, to be sure, but are also easy to be sympathetic for. They don't fully choose their lot in life, and dish out back at the world some degree of the torment leveled at themselves. In line with the sympathy for the Phantom, I find what Ethan says right after killing Beneviento to be quite interesting. He doesn't mock her or say something stupid like, "Fuck you," which would be right up his alley. Instead, he speaks to someone not even there, calmly saying, "Mia, I'll make things right." He understands, after this whole ordeal, that he is on his own, and that he has a responsibility, not just to Rose, but to Mia, to keep this family together. He's no longer afraid of the child. He's played a sick game of hide and seek to get there, but psychologically, he pushes past the fear of the child. Beneviento's parting gift, the now lifeless Angie, essentially her child, signifies the fear that is now crystallized. It no longer haunts his thoughts, but rests in his backpack. Now that Ethan has worked through his fear of feminine sexuality and children, he's got to reckon with the pitfalls of fatherhood with the impotent Salvatore Moreau and workaholic Carl Heisenberg. We inch closer to the end of Ethan's journey, but some huge questions loom over this tale. What is the significance of Mother Miranda, the game's principal female character shrouded in mystery? How will Ethan piece together Rose? What will become of Ethan's family? 2 of the 3 women Ethan can interact with are out of the picture, and now 2 men await his arrival. Whereas Ethan interacted with Beneviento and Dimitrescu as potential mothers and lovers, these 2, through their relationship with Mother Miranda, represent different kinds of fathers Ethan could be to his family, albeit potent examples not to be followed. First on the slate, Moreau. Hello, Error back with another interlude. Don't forget to drink some water, maybe you want to make a snack, maybe you want to take a break. All those are completely okay with me. There is a character that didn't make it into the full video, which is the Duke. The Duke is one of my favorite characters in Resident Evil Village. He's large, he's in charge, and he's really funny. Like other Resident Evil merchants, you buy things from him, you sell things to him, and he has a small role to play in the plot of the game itself. Unlike the merchant of Resident Evil 4, who comes across as a shady interloper, someone who wears a mask, kind of shows up in unexpected places, the Duke feels entrenched in the village of Mother Miranda. He's as much a part of this environment as Castle Dimitrescu is. We don't even really understand how the Duke gets around. I mean, he's huge. The Duke is bold and friendly. He projects a kind of discomforting level of calm in the horror environment of Resident Evil Village. But most importantly, he offers refuge to the player in multiple different ways, whether that's in Castle Dimitrescu, where his room, it seems like Lady Dimitrescu just can't go, or if we're looking at the late game, where he helps out Ethan in a pretty big, substantial way, but we'll save that for later. The Duke is a weird guy, but he completely elevates the world of Village and makes it feel more like a place that's really lived in, that has vying factions, that is interesting, more so than I think it comes across initially. I enjoy the levity he brings to the game, and while I can't tell you much about him, I think he's an important counterweight to the more horror aspects that we might see in a place like House Beneviento. Alright, popcorn popped? Well then, let's get on with the show. We are first introduced to Moreau at the same time as the rest of the villainous cast, but he fails to leave much of an impression at all. If not for the fact that he is pretty much the first thing Ethan sees as he wakes up, you might miss him completely. Fortunately, like a child who has found a pet frog, Moreau sidles up next to Ethan before being admonished by Angie, who tells him to move his ugly ass so she can get a good look at him. Moreau immediately starts crying and turns to Mother Miranda while pointing at Angie, seemingly about to cry out, "She called me ugly," before both of them are silenced by the brutish Heisenberg telling them to just shut up. He then silently goes and sits in the background for the rest of the scene, unremarkable and impotent. As we will come to find in this segment, Moreau's defining characteristic is impotency, but it is best we define that term first. Impotence can refer to a lack of sexual vigor, specifically men who can't keep it up for long enough to engage in intercourse. But that isn't how I see Moreau. Instead, I find he lacks any power or strength, despite his position of authority as one of Mother Miranda's lieutenants. He is, for all intents and purposes, a feckless adversary, one who might engender pity if he wasn't so disgusting. Takano explains that they purposefully designed Moreau to be the most repulsive character on Earth, and repulsive he is. Not just physically, but as a person. Moreau is a child in a monster's body. His mannerisms are immature and lack self-control. He craves attention and validation, but lacks any means of receiving it. He fawns over Mother Miranda and knows he is despised by those around him, but ultimately can only manage to barely live up to their meager expectations of him. He has illusions of grandeur that he could gain respect, but even if he were to accomplish his goals, he'd still be a pathetic sea monster. What makes Moreau interesting in this story is just how different he is from the far more entrepreneurial Heisenberg, dominating Dimitrescu, or manipulative Beneviento. Rather than inspiring fear through psychological terror or the threat of violence, Moreau is pathetic, and a deep fear arises when we contemplate his misery. Could we be like him? As a deformed water beast, Moreau is the spitting image of the Universal Studios monster, Gillman. You may be familiar with this character from the music video for the now meme song Ocean Man, or in the creature's far more artistic recreation in The Shape of Water. The creature of the Black Lagoon, like Moreau, is a bit of a black sheep out of the Universal Monster movie cast. In the original run of monster movies, it was one of the last to come out, and unlike Dr. Frankenstein, the Mummy, or Dracula, Gillman lacks the ability to talk. This makes it hard to relate to Gilman for the average audience goer, as his most salient human characteristic is his infatuation with the various women in his creature features. As we will see from Moreau, the inability to empathize with them is the defining feature of the character. The primary literary inspiration for Moreau is right in his name, Moreau, as in H.G. Wells' novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau. The novel's titular character is a mad scientist who performs vivisections on animals in order to grant them the intelligence and functions of humans, but is constantly disappointed that his experiments eventually revert back to their animalistic instincts. He does these experiments on an island in the middle of the sea, away from the prying eyes of those meddling animal rights groups in Britain who abolished vivisection. The narrator of the story, Prendick, ends up trapped on the island, eventually witnessing the death of Moreau at the hands of his own creation. He barely escapes himself as the animals return to a feral state in the time after Moreau is gone. Returning to Britain, Prendick becomes uncomfortable around other humans, feeling that, like Moreau's beast folk, they could revert to animalism at any time. While ostensibly a story about the potential intelligence of animals given the right surgical opportunities, Wells turns that notion on its head in the novel's conclusion, asking the age-old question, what if we were the animals all along? As one of the best-known books by a father of science fiction, The Island of Dr. Moreau had a profound impact on the genre, particularly stories of a biological nature, a category that the Resident Evil games fall into and owe much of their thematic material. Just as the franchise situates its discourse around the ethics and dangers of biological weapons, The Island of Dr. Moreau is a discussion of vivisection, a hot-button topic in the Scientific Society of Britain at the time Wells was writing the novel. Vivisections, or surgical operations on live animals for the purpose of scientific research, are grossly unethical, but were believed by some at the time to have genuine scientific merit. Wells himself wrote that the beast folk of the novel were plausible outside of the realm of science fiction, and would have been a natural outcome of the scientific research into vivisections that was stopped by animal rights groups. He was mistaken, but the fact that he believed his fiction was truly possible is telling for how much the subject loomed over British intellectual and moral thought at the time. Gresham Braun gives us a great understanding of this context for the original story. She argues that in its account of vivisection gone awry, the novel is an investigation into the potential humanity of animals and the unarguable animality of humans. She finds that the novel
participates in the Victorian intellectual project of defining species boundaries through moral and emotional response. These boundaries, like those of class and race, were reinforced culturally but challenged on a physiological level by evolutionary biology. Wells' novel ultimately reveals the logical failure of separating moral and affective life from biological.
The book engenders a sense of uncertainty in the human reader, suggesting that their hierarchical superiority to animals may not be so sound, just as the lichens in the game seem, at least in some ways, superior to the eponymous village's residents. But this is where the book and game diverge. Braun notes that Pendrick's empathy for victims of Moreau's intellectual curiosity is a defining trait of the novel.
By grounding empathy in instinctive physiological reflex rather than reason, The Island of Dr. Moreau undermines humanity's claim to moral superiority over animals, and thereby calls into question the validity of conventional classificatory systems.
While Resident Evil also points to the dangers of separating moral and scientific visions of the world through its mad scientists and evil corporation tropes, Village does not interrogate these classifications as thoroughly as The Island of Dr. Moreau. Instead, it situates Mother Miranda, a biologist herself, as inherently above her creations in both power and hierarchy. The game doesn't develop her as the direct successor to Dr. Moreau because, as we will learn later, she has a more personal reason for her abominations than Moreau's vapid "because science." So, instead of finding compassion for the game's abominable creations like Pendrick does in the novel, Village's players spend their time killing them. They only get familiar with those in power, the monsters that made the monsters. While any sane person would get the, man, doing these experiments on people is bad vibe from the game, it doesn't ask us to empathize with the lesser creatures like lichens, zombie maids, or even its lords. Just shoot them. While I would argue that this entire video is me trying to do such empathetic work, as you can tell from its runtime, this empathy isn't as obvious as Wells' tale of vivisection, and it's much more localized to the experience of Ethan's fear of fatherhood. Still, some empathy can be had for Lady Dimitrescu, who suffers the grief of her daughter's death before her own demise, and for Beneviento, a scarred woman who looks at Ethan as potential family. But what sympathy can we find for a creature like Moreau, who perhaps more than any other monster in the game resembles the ugly beast folk from Wells' tale? Though we shouldn't overlook that Moreau is also a Dr. Moreau in this story. The influence Wells' novel had on Village becomes apparent if you read some of its extraneous notes. Later in the game, we learn Moreau accidentally created the lichens by infusing some of his dying patients with wolf blood, causing them to mutate into half-animal, half-human creatures, not unlike those found on Dr. Moreau's island. These creatures do not seem to retain anything we might describe as humanity like Moreau's creations, though. They are bloodthirsty zombies whose only purpose is to hunt down and kill others. Not even for food, really, just for sport. What's the fun in that? While Pendrick gets the opportunity to explore the island and befriend Moreau's menagerie, Ethan does not get such a chance as the lichens attack him on sight. They are Moreau's legacy in the fiction of the game, and apt to his character, he didn't even intentionally make them. Moreau is the only one of Miranda's four lords who cannot control their form, and thus is stuck as a hideous blob of a man-child rather than the more human-appearing Dimitrescu or Heisenberg. This inability to pass as human evokes the animalistic troubles of Wells's beastfolk, who are always teetering between their newfound human natures and their wild instincts. He is thus trapped in a purposefully hideous body, the butt of other characters' jokes who find him pathetic and miserable, and his section of Village is far and away the least memorable. Though this is by design, because Moreau is a vision of the absent parent, the archetype itself, and the child they leave behind. This is how Ethan relates to Moreau. In one of the most thematically striking scenes in the game, Ethan sneaks up on the fishman and easily snatches Rose's arms while he just stands silently, staring at a garbled television screen. It is alarming just how much Moreau is not there, even within his own lair. He is devoid of life and personality. This lack is reaffirmed just moments after Ethan rescues that piece of his daughter, when Moreau violently vomits onto the floor. He is, for all intents and purposes, a child. He is not only incompetent, but seems to lack human vitality or even basic animalistic instinct. He is closer to nothing than he is something. As he turns to Ethan, he moans, "Mother Miranda, if it is for you, I'd do anything." It is unclear whether he even knows Ethan is there when he starts this sentence. He then just stares at Ethan with the same blank intensity he had for the static. Eventually realizing what's going on, he confusedly asks what Ethan is doing with Mother Miranda's child. He implores Ethan not to take it, saying, "Please, please, if you take it, the others, they'll laugh at me." Unlike Dimitrescu, who served Miranda out of loyalty and hunted Ethan for revenge, Moreau is pettily concerned with the opinion of others, thinking that if he is smart, he can fix everything. He begins to openly weep in front of Ethan, appearing to wallow in his impotence. But in a twist, he starts giggling, asserting that Ethan is the stupid one, and he has plugged all of the ways out of his lair, trapping Ethan forever in his hell. In the game's funniest joke, we then just turn around and walk out of the lair. It can't be understated how confusing this initially is for the first-time player. You thought you'd have to outwit a biological mass of a labyrinth. Nah, just leave the way you came. No biggie. This moment emphasizes just how pitiful and ineffective the game wants to portray Moreau. But why go through all this trouble of making such a pathetic creature? Moreau isn't simply comic relief. He shows the consequences of a lack of father for Ethan. First of all, Moreau is the father of the Lycans in the game, a boss, a lord of the village, and yet he has no influence over them. He is a background character even in his own territory, an absent father through and through. The Lycans themselves bear no resemblance to their bulbous creator and take no order from him. More importantly, Moreau is the child of an absent father in the narrative. He worships Mother Miranda and is incessantly loyal to her, and more so than any of the other lords, actually believes her to be Mommy. But Mom works long hours at the biology lab making zombies, so poor little Moreau is left all alone at his home, a sad boy addicted to his little television. I do feel bad for Moreau, not because I can see myself in him, but because I can't. He is as extreme of a horror allegory of the left alone child as Dimitrescu is of the sexualized woman. So, to fully understand him, I think we need to turn to one of the most potent examples of the absent father in literature, Hamlet. We're not going to do a full rundown of the play today, but the quick and dirty of it is that Hamlet is a prince whose daddy is dead, and now the indecisive young man must figure out what to do as his uncle steals the throne, and his country's enemies are primed to attack. It is the missing King Hamlet, whose ghost haunts his son and the other inhabitants of the castle, that acts as the catalyst for the drama that unfolds. Without a strong father figure, Hamlet cannot act. The state falls apart, and a bunch of people die in the ensuing chaos. Moreau is not Hamlet. Not even close. Hamlet is eloquent, if a bit insane, and Moreau voices his desire with the tact of a drunk toddler. Hamlet feigns madness at points, but Moreau is simply mad. But in him, we find a disturbing mirror of Hamlet's struggle, an ineffectual character with no one to guide them through the world. In Hamlet, it is a missing father that causes malady. If the father could be put back together, perhaps there would be hope, not just for the son, but the entire kingdom. Instead, it is a tragedy, and the family cannot be reunited, even if King Hamlet's ghost is metaphysically hanging out with his son. Moreau exhibits the same kinds of indecision and tragedy as Hamlet, and thus acts as a mirror for Ethan to consider what his family might look like if he's not there. Further, like Hamlet, Moreau has some weird Oedipal feelings for his mother. Before he turns into his monstrous final form, which again he explicitly says he does not have control over, he complains to Ethan that it should be him with Mother Miranda, not Ethan. Not only implying in this story Ethan is the archetypical father and Miranda the archetypical mother, much more on that later, but that he has a sexual attraction, a desire to be with Mother. Hamlet likewise directs sexual energy toward his mother, with a pivotal scene in the play taking place in her bedchambers, the space of intimacy. In both instances, with the absence of the father, the notion of the family becomes charged with obscene possibility. Moreau is an image of the grotesque fear of absence, of what happens to an individual with no love or empathy. Perhaps Ethan fears his family will see him like he sees Moreau, an impotent loser whose ineffectual actions caused the downfall of the entire family. The absent father does not always need to literally be far away. He could just be sitting in his lazy boy, staring at the TV. Perhaps Moreau is a vision of how Ethan's child will turn out if he is an absent father. In either case, the dangers of the destroyed family unit are laid bare for Ethan to consider. The fear of impotence, of not having an impact on his family, must be challenged to overcome and defeat Moreau. For Moreau's part, this feckless nature makes this fear the easiest for Ethan to overcome. He transforms into a massive fish creature that attacks Ethan as he makes his way across a flooded village, yet cannot overcome even simple blocks of wood when trying to chomp at his feet. Ethan then neuters Moreau even further by opening a dam and draining the village of any water. Heading down to confront him once and for all, we see Moreau in his final form, less like a fish creature from hell and more like a fish flapping about on a boat, trying to get back into the water. Moreau's final boss form is large, slow, and cumbersome, but he poses little threat to Ethan. Beneviento put the player on a clock: find Angie 3 times in a short period, or die. Dimitrescu found ways to corner and maim our hero. Moreau, we can kind of just walk away from and let him follow us. He's pathetic. True to form, Moreau is even more disgusting than usual as a boss. He literally vomits up acid rain to try and hurt Ethan. He doesn't seem to get stronger as he changes forms, but rather seems to revert further and further into his psychological hole. In this final form, he seems to retract all the way back into the womb. His tough exterior is impenetrable, with the player only able to hurt Moreau when he comes out of his shell. Yet, the entire time I was fighting him, I didn't feel much disgust or horror. I felt annoyed. Annoyed that this boss fight takes so long. Annoyed that Moreau wouldn't bite the bullet and die. I haven't done the math exactly, but it requires so much ammunition and time to take him out. It's surreal and frustrating. He also won't shut up. He keeps saying things like, "Don't you love me, mommy? I'll make you proud, mother. Watch me." And "You're the reason mother doesn't love me." He simply won't get off the Oedipal train and forces us to ride with him. The nuisance of it all has to be the point. The designers made almost every other boss fight at least a little interesting. They've shown themselves to be competent game designers. And then this fight comes along. It feels like it takes twice as long as any of the other lords and is half as difficult. The whole ordeal reaffirms Moreau's pitiful nature, without giving us an opportunity to actually take pity on him. In the end, Moreau explodes into sickening bits while calling out for Mother to help him. Ethan responds to this with his normal, dumb writing, in death as he was in life. Disgusting. But I can't help but feel like Moreau plays an important part in his story. If the island of Dr. Moreau's message boils down to empathy, Moreau's demise is clearly about disgust. Heck, that's exactly what Ethan says. Empathy and disgust are opposite emotions in a lot of ways. Disgust motivates the individual to avoid the offending object, while empathy requires them to draw close, if not literally then spiritually, as they emotionally connect with whatever is causing the empathetic reaction. So what are we supposed to do with Moreau, whose literary references from Dr. Moreau to Hamlet are moving texts about human emotion, and yet this fish guy is just there? It's hard to have any compassion for him or to put ourselves in his shoes. Maybe that's the point. The fact that we can't empathize with Moreau, that we're disgusted by him, proves that we aren't like him. That we won't repeat the mistakes that led to this strange fish man with mommy issues vomiting up acid rain in a vain attempt to gain recognition. To overcome his fear of impotence, his worry that he won't be enough or that he might abandon his family, Ethan Winters must prove that he can't find himself in anything resembling the kind of person who would. He overcomes his fear of being an absent father by showing himself that he does care, that he pushes forward through adversity, that he doesn't stop when the going gets tough. At the end of the Beneviento section, Ethan promises Mia he'll save Rose. At the end of the Moreau section, he makes the same promise, but to himself. As Ethan prepares to leave Moreau's sanctum, he has to make one last pit stop at Moreau's media room to grab a piece of a key, or a piece of pie, I guess is what I wrote in my script. He's free to read Moreau's journal, where we finally start to get a picture of Mother Miranda's plans for Rose. She wants to use Rose as a vessel to bring back her real child. Moreau questions if this means she will abandon him, if that's the case, and then writes, "No," repeated for an entire page. When I first encountered this journal, I legitimately laughed out loud. The fear of Moreau, of becoming like him, becomes completely distilled the moment we are able to do just that. I feel bad for Moreau, but I don't feel like him, and that is a relief. We don't have time to get cozy though, as the television turns on, and Heisenberg congratulates us on our victories so far, and offers to lend us a hand in taking out Mother Miranda, and more importantly, getting our Rose back. What's his game? We'll find out soon. Heisenberg, the last of Miranda's lords Ethan has to face, is the first he meets. While adventuring up towards the castle, Heisenberg interrupts our journey, knocks us out, and drags us to a meeting of all the major villains. Like Dimitrescu, he toys with Ethan, views him as a tool he can use at best, and as a plaything to torture at worst. As Dimitrescu and Heisenberg argue over who gets to take Ethan, she calls him a child multiple times, a fact emphasized by the large gap in their sizes. She also questions his loyalty to Miranda in an attempt to win Miranda over. While both characters are ultimately duplicitous and act in childlike ways throughout the narrative, Dimitrescu was right about him. Despite all his attempts to come across as the masculine head of the lords, ultimately Heisenberg is undone by his childlike tendencies. While Benevento plays with dolls and Moreau craves mommy's approval, Heisenberg's most prominent childish quality is his playfulness. This playful nature is perhaps best emphasized in the trial that he sets up for Ethan after the village section. Ostensibly a show for everyone, all it really does is stroke his ego. He talks to Ethan throughout speakers the entire performance, making jokes like how a trap is going to turn the main character into fresh ground American beef. We can tell Heisenberg is playful, but in a cruel way that emphasizes his disregard for human life and dignity. Heisenberg strikes me as the kid who uses a magnifying glass on ants. He's bigger and more diabolical than the creatures he picks apart, but any sense of maturity is lost in the mindless way he goes about his Machiavellian schemes. Still, outside of Chris Redfield, Heisenberg is the most stereotypically masculine character of the game's primary cast. Unlike Moreau, who talks and acts like a child, Heisenberg puts on a face to come across as more mature and put together than he actually is. On the face of it then, Heisenberg is one of the characters Ethan can most easily identify with as a man and as a father. And indeed, he is the only one of the major villains to offer something amounting to equality with the lead character rather than the brutal violence of being hunted and killed. While not literally the same age, Heisenberg and Ethan are both middle-aged men who have learned to some degree what responsibility is. So, initially, just like we might view Dimitrescu or Benevento as potential mother models for Ethan to grapple with, or Moreau as a potential father model, albeit an absent father, Heisenberg is offered as a potential father model for Ethan to consider. What kind of father is Heisenberg then? He's certainly more hands-on than Moreau is with the Lycans, as they actually seem to listen to him and respect him. For instance, they indulge him in his game for Ethan. Also, unlike Moreau, who spends his days absent-mindedly watching television, Heisenberg is an industrious individual. He runs a factory, appears to be intelligent, and works hard to achieve his goals. Moreover, he actually seems to have goals. In a vacuum, these are positive qualities, the kinds that are often rewarded in our capitalistic society. But are they qualities that make for a good dad? The proof to that is in how Heisenberg acts in regards to Ethan's child, Rose, and how he treats his machine creations. Regarding those machine creations, they point us to the movie monster Heisenberg most clearly represents, Frankenstein. And yes, I mean both the monster who was jolted into existence by a bolt of lightning and the monster who facilitated that process. As a potential father figure, Dr. Frankenstein is a weird character. He usurps the maternal order by making life without the aid of a female partner, and thus presents a distinctly masculine and solitary idea of parenthood. Moreover, he's a pretty terrible father, someone who primarily views his creation, or if we are so bold, child, as an extension of himself and his genius, until it goes rogue, and then hunts it down with a murderous rage. Heisenberg, likewise, has an entire factory of Frankenstein's monsters that he has created for Ethan to play with, but perhaps he is just a monster himself. Continuing with the story, Ethan enters Heisenberg's factory and has a meeting with him. In this meeting, Heisenberg reveals quite a bit of narrative information that has been hitherto now concealed from Ethan, information that gives more credence to our hypothesis that this is a game about fatherhood. He explains that Mother Miranda has been sending her lords at Ethan not to kill him, but as a test, to see if he can be part of their family. It is relatively clear that Ethan would be the father in this scenario, even if Miranda wears the pants in the family. When Ethan rejects the idea, Heisenberg interjects that he rejected it too, but here we are. Heisenberg explicitly characterizes Ethan's quest as a capitalistic one. Kill him and move up the chain of corporate hierarchy. He then offers an alternative quest, where they can work together and start a hostile takeover of Miranda's empire, using Rose as the weapon that will get them there. Ethan's rejection of this plan, telling Heisenberg that his daughter is not a weapon, causes the two to be at violent odds with one another, and for him to kick Ethan down into the hellscape that is his deranged factory. But before we get to Frankenstein's lab, let's consider Heisenberg's worldview. To him, everyone and everything is a means to an end, a tool to get what he wants. He views Ethan and Rose as tools to help him overcome Miranda. He uses the Lycans like pawns in his little game too, and he manipulates the villagers of the village as puppets to be reconstructed in his own metallic image. Thus, he hates Mother Miranda, not because she is evil or manipulative, but per his worldview, he can only come to one conclusion. He is her tool and nothing more. Until she is destroyed, he can never be free because he'll always consider himself to be her machine, just like how the propeller monster below is his instrument of destruction. Talk about someone taking up real estate in your head. This is the other side of the Oedipal coin we saw with Moreau. While that ocean man was the boy in love with his mother, this machine man is the boy who wants to kill her. It's not purely Oedipus Rex, since it's not killing the father, but it's about as close as we can get in this narrative. And don't forget that in the play, his mom, Jocasta, dies all the same. In this sense, Heisenberg is the child Dimitrescu says he was, as his strong desire to destroy his pseudo-mother places him more as her child than if he was able to accept his subordination and place in the hierarchy. Heisenberg is forever a child, trapped in the mentality of being inferior, and it is this inferiority complex which defines his motivation throughout the plot of the game. Unlike Moreau, who views Rose as competition for Miranda's affections, Heisenberg views her as another child with another axe to grind. His description of what they will do to Miranda, grind her into paste, displays the extreme need he has not just to kill Miranda, but remove any reference of her from the picture. Thus, Heisenberg is not just Dr. Frankenstein, but Frankenstein's monster. Like the monster, Heisenberg wants nothing more than to kill the person who created him. He despises Miranda, like the monster despises Frankenstein, not just for creating him, but then neglecting and imprisoning him. He views himself not as a miracle of science or as one of the most powerful people on the planet, which considering his intellect and his magnetic powers, he surely is, but as a monster, a mistake, a cobbled together mess of a person, and he takes out all that frustration on the person who made him that way. When Ethan won't join him in this righteous matricidal crusade, the father of machines sends our main character into the depths of his diabolical factory, where humans are cattle, and metal takes the place of flesh. The horrific depravity of Heisenberg's creations mirrors Miranda's perverse creativity, the same energy that made him. The first of these monsters Ethan runs into is Sturm, who had been interrupting the pair's conversation with loud noises. Sturm, a propeller with legs, is an external representation of Heisenberg's everybody and everything is a tool mentality, a merging of machine and man. Sturm is neither and both, a kind of cyborg rather than a true zombie. He hunts Ethan through a chase sequence reminiscent of the game Heisenberg put him through earlier, with chainsaw propellers and a huge metal body merged with human legs and some chopped off arms. Sturm is a wonderfully creative piece of character design come to life. He's genuinely terrifying, as an adversary who will chop you to bits the moment he gets close, as an example of what Heisenberg does to people, and as a metaphor for contemporary factory capitalism, which, through its focus on specialization over all else, values the individual who will sacrifice all aspects of themselves to be the exact tool for the job. The other mutant humans populating Heisenberg's factory follow suit. The most basic of these are haulers, who wear rags over bruised and battered bodies. their most distinguishable feature being the mind-controlling headgear that covers most of their face and directs their actions. The headpiece covers up most of the face of each hauler, making them indistinguishable from each other, faceless and nameless. Sound familiar? It's always particularly eerie when you can't see a creature's eyes, because, as we all know, the eyes are the windows to the soul. These creatures feel soulless. In the end, the haulers are simple factory workers in the fiction of the game. They attack Ethan, but are not proficient in combat, posing little threat other than to set the atmosphere of the setting. Much more imposing than the haulers are the soldats, mutant machine hybrids designed for combat. They have glowing red mechanical hearts, also known as Cadeau reactors, and drills for arms. They are the enforcers down here. Their production is the purpose of the factory. These deadly foes are fast, and whether they've got 1, 2, or 6 drills to punch you with, they are formidable foes. The jet version can even fly. In essence, Heisenberg has recreated the military-industrial complex in his basement and now hopes to use its full power to kill his pseudo-mom. How original. I know it's pretty on the nose, almost so much that it might not need to be discussed, but this factory is a metaphor for modern capitalism. Factories in horror games, whether Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, or Inside, tend to work as a substitute for the entire economic system, though I've typically found such horror settings lack the subtlety that often interests me in the genre. The factory itself carries markers from the height of industrialization in the 19th century, the same time Karl Marx was making his own formulations on capital's effects on people. Heisenberg makes the illusion pretty clear with language like, "The strong will destroy the weak, that's the way of the world." Whereas the other 3 lords of the village feel ripped from time, specifically pre-industrialization, with Heisenberg, we're clearly moving into a more modern territory. I don't think I need to treat you to a treatise on the woes of capitalism here right now, so let's just say it's here, and keep moving. Because the aesthetic design of the factory and its inhabitants is reminiscent of something I find more interesting. The 1989 Japanese body horror classic, Tetsuo, the Iron Man. Though I need to tell you that Tetsuo the Iron Man is the most disturbing thing we're going to talk about probably in this whole video. Like, it legitimately makes me sick. I'm only going to show some of the tamer stuff from the movie in this video. Tetsuo the Iron Man is a low-budget, avant-garde film with little in the way of dialogue or plot, but tons in terms of depth to explore in terms of semiotics. The film catapulted director Shinya Tsukamoto to international recognition, with many popular filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, David Fincher's, and the Wachowskis citing it as an influence on their style. Though, I won't fault you if you've never heard of it, or if you don't watch it, because in a lot of regards, it is an unpalatable movie. In it, the salaryman, a stereotypical middle-class, white-collar Japanese worker, strikes a metal fetishist, almost killing him. The salaryman is tormented by visions of this fetishist, and his skin slowly begins turning into iron. He fantasizes about sex with metal objects, and kills his girlfriend. The fetishist then hunts down the salaryman, but in their climactic confrontation, the pair become one, and pledge to make the entire Earth into a metal abomination, just like them. It managed to be popular enough to generate 2 sequels, Tetsuo II, The Body Hammer, and Tetsuo, The Bullet Man, which continue exploring this Cronenberg relationship with machines. Tetsuo is a bizarre cult film with startling imagery of man and machine coming together. Its fusions of flesh and metal are not sleek and attractive, but brutal and gory. It presents becoming transhuman, that being an individual merged with machine, as a dangerous, abstract, and mind-altering event that forever changes a person. Perhaps the most straightforward interpretation of its events can be found in Fabio Papi's discussion of the film. They write that the film embodies the ideological content that emerges concerning the ontological and the artificial, and find that
the wide use of metaphors that merge machine and human body, and more generally the hybridization between the natural and artificial domains, describe an ideology that produces an inhuman society that is capable of infecting and transforming the body and mind.
The Resident Evil franchise has always been concerned with how capitalist ideology can produce an inhuman society that infects and transforms the mind. After all, what else is an evil corporation that creates zombies for monetary gain? Yet, a different kind of fear is generated when that post-human biological instinct is traded for a mechanical one, isn't it? The machine of horror fiction is more extreme, less malleable than flesh. It has a brutish, uncompromising character. It not only represents the dehumanizing properties of capitalism like the zombie, but the idea that those properties are not the uncontrollable result of an unhappy experiment, but the intended result of intense, amoral deliberation. In short, by incorporating machine body horror into its narrative, Village suggests to us that the same impulses that drive the zombie media drive the machine ones too. Perhaps more important than this thematic understanding of Tetsuo is understanding the rich legacy of its visual design. The horrific machine man depictions of Tetsuo have a clear cinematic progeny, particularly the machine designs in The Matrix, but more generally across all manner of futuristic intellectual properties. It and Akira are probably the two most influential pieces of media on the Japanese cyberpunk genre. This influence can be deeply felt both in the character of Heisenberg and his factory. Heisenberg's monstrous final form takes an obvious cue from the massive metal monsters we find at the concluding acts of Tetsuo's 1 and 2. Meanwhile, the design of the haulers and soldats, particularly their fancy headgear, are incredibly evocative of the factory characters in Tetsuo 2. This isn't to say there aren't a myriad of other influences on this section in the game, but what strikes me about the Tetsuo connection is just how natural its themes and aesthetic end up fitting within the framework of a Resident Evil game. As much as I don't care for Heisenberg as a villain, as he's a one-note character who essentially repeats, "I want to kill mommy and strike out on my own" in 200 different ways, his factory is one of the most potently metaphorical areas of the game. Village spends so much of its energy looking back, whether to Universal movie monsters, gothic horror novels, or 80s slasher films. So its retrofitting of the machine man politics feels odd because it's looking forward, adding something new to the Resident Evil formula, imagining something fresher than old school vampires or fish men. It is the new fears conjured up in this section, those of becoming one with the machine, becoming more artificial than human, having your mind and body transformed by the sick application of capitalist ideology, that we find the fear Ethan has to confront in Heisenberg's factory. Not just becoming a cog in the machine, but transforming into the machine itself. I imagine this as a workaholic father whose identity becomes rooted in something other than his family. In this instance, we might consider it labor under capitalism itself. The fear is just as potent whether we look at the monsters Heisenberg created or their creator. In the former, we see mindless drones working in a factory. They have the freedom Heisenberg so desperately desires ripped from them, and now they live only to serve. They are inhuman husks wandering the grounds. They complete tasks, but to what end? To help a depraved man-child be set free? In Heisenberg, Ethan finds someone who has been so thoroughly corrupted by the ideology of the factory that he views everyone else as either instruments in his own quest or obstacles in the way. In the end, while he certainly wields more power than those beneath him, he is just as much a servant to the superstructure that contains him as his underlings. Is this the image of life that Ethan wants? Of the father that he will become? After witnessing the factory's horrors and climbing out of it, Ethan comes face to face with Heisenberg yet again, this time revealing his truly monstrous metal form. As each piece of cold steel comes into contact with him, he resembles more the freakish creations from the mind of Shinya Tsukamoto until he stands over Ethan as a towering figure that his conventional weapons cannot harm. He knocks Ethan into the depths of the factory and warns him to not come back again. In the depths below, Ethan finds perhaps the only man on Earth he hates more than Heisenberg, Chris Redfield, the only other man left in the narrative who could truly be considered a model of fatherhood. Our protagonist would never even consider it though, because this is the same man who murdered Ethan's wife. Or at least that's what we believed up until this point in the narrative. Quite unceremoniously though, Chris gives us the lore dump, letting us in on the big secret. That woman we saw murdered in front of us to incite this entire story wasn't Mia, but Mother Miranda in disguise. This plot twist has been much maligned by the broader community as a whole. Noah Caldwell-Gervais describes the whole plot hinging on Chris withholding plot details because of his capricious antisocial impulse to just let Ethan go fuck himself. I wouldn't go that far. An easy narrative fix here could have been for Chris to tell Ethan that the real Mia's dead, which is what he believes to be true anyways, and then the pair get separated, like they already do in the narrative. And Ethan goes off to save his daughter, and bam, we're right back where we started in the village segment. So, if it's not really necessary for the plot, why is Chris such an asshole? The reason he gives for being an asshole is that he didn't want Ethan to get involved, which he knew he would want to if his daughter was on the line. This reveals the kind of father Chris is, a jaded individual who keeps other people at arm's length. Chris treats Ethan like a child at the start of the narrative, but Ethan has now proven he's more of an adult than Chris by conquering his fear of fatherhood. So the two finally start to work together to take down Mother Miranda. That's right, Ethan finally has a friend on this adventure other than the Duke. The reason I give you for the weird two wives narrative move is that it highlights the primary theme of the game we've been exploring throughout this entire video: parenthood. Ethan's motivation for saving his daughter throughout most of the game is two-pronged. He's a single father, all his daughter has to rely on, and he has no support system. His only living friend on this continent betrayed him. This forces Ethan to not pass off the duties of parenthood on someone else, but to take responsibility of the situation and do his best to figure it all out. If Ethan had a sliver of hope Mia was alive, he wouldn't have the catharsis of telling her that he'll make things right. If he thought Chris Redfield would swoop in and save the day, he would have hunkered down with the Duke and just waited to be saved. Instead, Capcom uses Ethan's plight to paint a picture of fatherhood that it wants the character to conform to, a responsible, capable, and thoughtful individual who, above all else, sacrifices himself for the good of the child. That kind of sacrifice will become much more apparent in the next section, though, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The point is that Ethan's psychological journey through the fear of parenthood necessitates a personal belief that he is all Rose has. Thus, it is only when he conquers those fears, defeating Dimitrescu, Beneviento, and Moreau, and escaping Heisenberg's factory, that he's emotionally ready to co-parent with someone else. Chris, though, displays what will happen to Ethan if he goes too far down the silent protector route of fatherhood. He is filled with regret from his past mistakes, as we learn from his cigarette break later on in the game. He is weary and laden with the burden of responsibility, but at least he works as a team with Ethan, the first true companion Ethan's had since Elena dropped into the fire. That was a long time ago. He gives Ethan a war machine made of carbon instead of metal, so Heisenberg can't manipulate it, and slaps him on the ass and tells him to go raise some hell. It's not the most nuanced of approaches, but it is here where Ethan is the most empowered to save his daughter. And it's important that it comes off the heels of finally having someone to lean on in his crusade to get his daughter back. Ethan's fight with Heisenberg is bombastic and dramatic, but ultimately a bit of a letdown. Heisenberg complains about Mommy almost as much as Moreau, but whereas Moreau was pitiful, Heisenberg just comes across as kind of lazily written. He does at least pay lip service to Ethan, noting that this must be a fatherly love, and he calls Chris a boulder-punching asshole, which is just one of the many game's weird in-references to previous lore but at least shows the game has a bit of a sense of humor about itself. His last words reaffirm his Oedipal issues, saying he must kill her before exploding into bits. In reality, we had already overcome whatever fear he had of us when we escaped the factory. This boss fight only feels necessary to get us to the next part of the narrative. And the next few moments are quite a doozy. Ethan's finally done it, defeated all the lords. Only Mother Miranda remains between him and his daughter. But before he can make his way toward her, she's already got the jump on him. It's finally time, now that Ethan has pushed past all his fears of fatherhood, to face a final foe worthy of his complex psychological journey. And who better fitting than a mother looking to save her own child? Hey, back again as you're getting close to the finish line. I hope you're enjoying the video. If not, you've really been watching it for a long time for something you're not enjoying. But if you do like it, why don't you tell me why you like it down in the comments below? Give me a little bit of encouragement to maybe do something like this again. What I know is that a lot of people did not like the Chris Redfield section of the game, which takes place between Heisenberg's factory and the final boss confrontation with Mother Miranda. In this section, we control Chris Redfield. Instead of the fragile and abusable Ethan Winters, we become a super soldier. We can take out Lycans left and right with high-powered military equipment. This section is not meaningfully difficult, and despite its shortness, we get a lot of the narrative twists here, such as Mia is still alive, which is great, too bad Ethan doesn't know, and Mother Miranda taught Oswald Spencer everything that he knows, and it's just like, okay. I think that this section kind of ties the game into the other Resident Evil games a lot more, but it feels superfluous. It feels like it shouldn't be here. These are half-baked narrative moments, and while I understand the need for a break between Heisenberg's factory and Mother Miranda's final boss fight, this ain't it, Chief. Please, Capcom. There are enough military shooters in the world. We don't need another. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of the video, and I'll see you when we're all done. After defeating Heisenberg, Ethan talks to Chris on the phone before Miranda rudely interrupts their conversation disguised as Mia. She taunts our protagonist, questioning why he couldn't tell the difference between the two mothers. She reveals her true form and continues her villainous monologue, dumping the exposition of her evil plan on the player. That Rose is Evelyn, the villain from Resident Evil VII, Biohazard, reincarnated, or perhaps perfected, and will be reborn as her long-lost daughter, Ava. Ethan adamantly refuses, vowing to protect Rose, but as his use as a lab rat has run out, she surprises him and rips out his literal heart. We watch as she squeezes it over her face before blacking out, presumably dying. During this scene, we learn that Mother Miranda was the crazy old witch we'd been interacting with throughout the game. This witch had given Ethan cryptic advice as to Rose's location and whereabouts, generally creeped him out, and added a layer of mystery to the village's vaguely religious nature. When the game reveals that Miranda wasn't just your dead wife all along, but this character, I was genuinely a little surprised or perhaps just disappointed. I hoped to see more development of the village's spiritual reverence for its leading lady, and finding out the one living character who seemed to worship her, as opposed to the more personal familial connections of the now 4 deceased lords, was, in fact, her, was underwhelming. But it does give us an opportunity to understand the relationship between Daddy Ethan and Mommy Miranda a little bit better. The first few scenes together occurred just a bit after Ethan is nearly killed by Lycans in the village. The hag comes across as insane, saying that Rose has cursed the entire village and plunged it into darkness, and later chanting about how death has come to them all. She is jovial in the face of the massacre, seeming to relish in the chaos of the moment. Later, the pair meet again after Ethan has taken down Lady Dimitrescu. Ethan interrupts her as she performs some kind of ceremony worshipping Mother Miranda. Talk about ego. She instructs Ethan to turn his focus on the four lords to get pieces of his daughter back, and remarks on how he is almost dead and how that is a riddle for the wise. In each of the instances, the hag, aka Miranda, pushes Ethan forward toward eliminating her other children and hopefully becoming the father she wants him to be. She didn't have to do this. She could have eliminated the lords herself, but she purposefully split Rose up into pieces to give Ethan motivation for hunting them down. This has been a game to her, the goal being to see if Ethan has the moxie to be her partner in raising their shared child. Ethan does learn how to be a better father through her gamut of terrors, but not the kind she was hoping for. His resolve to save Rose from her only grows with each victory and setback, until he makes absolutely clear to her that he won't stop until she's gone. This forces her hand, and results in her taking his heart. This is not just a method of killing him, but a representation of what she feels is wrong with Ethan. He's got too much compassion for Rose, and it's clouding his better judgment. In some ways, she is right on the money. Rose is just another faceless baby. What does it matter to him if she's reborn as Ava or Rose? In the end, outside of the fact that Mother Miranda is pretty much pure evil. This is why it's so important Ethan believes Mia is dead, because he promised her to make things right, and right by Mia is honoring her memory and keeping Rose as their daughter, not giving her up to be the daughter of someone else. Even if he could remain her father, she would cease to be Mia's if he went through with this deal. The poetry of Resident Evil Village's protagonist and villain is that they are both motivated by the exact same thing, a desire to save their child from death. The primary difference between them being that Miranda's child died 100 years ago in the Spanish flu, and Ethan's has yet to die, despite being torn in 4 pieces and shared amongst a cabal of kids with mommy issues. In each villain, up until this point, their design, desires, and issues with Mother Miranda have underpinned Ethan's own fears of fatherhood. Defeating each one represented him overcoming those anxieties. In Miranda, Ethan faces the last stop on his journey to becoming a fully realized parent, getting over the death of Mia. Miranda's issue isn't that she lost her daughter, it's that she never moved on, choosing to commit suicide instead of accepting it as a reality. She could have tried for a new child, adopted one, or found a new family. In fact, she did do those things, but only in service of finding a way to revive Ava. The documents found in the Chris section reveal that each of the 4 lords were potential candidates for Ava's resurrection, but each being unfit for the ceremony for one reason or another. She could have accepted this family as her own, but instead she single-mindedly continued her pursuit of one thing only, rewinding the clock to bring back her daughter. She's a lot like Ethan in this way, is she not? Think of all the destruction Ethan causes, in both Biohazard and Village, to rescue Mia and Rose. Both of them are willing to do anything to protect the ones they love. Thus, Miranda's presence in the narrative begs the question, what if Ethan can't get over Mia's death? Even if he saves Rose, what if he can't accept the new family he'll have, 2 instead of 3? Will he take all that destructive potential and turn its energy toward bringing Mia back? Or will his inability to get over the loss deeply impact his ability to parent Rose? Just like Ethan could see some of himself in Heisenberg, looking at Miranda should be like gazing into a mirror. An exaggerated version of himself, his good qualities so inflated, they turn evil. Of course, Ethan has little ability to reflect on these truths because he's dead. Or is he? Well, yes, he is, but just not exactly in the way we originally thought. After Chris Redfield's section, we get a dream sequence in which Evelyn confronts Ethan within his subconscious. Like Miranda, They both seem to know something about him that he does not, and were finally able and ready to learn what. Evelyn tells him he's dead, and he replies, "I still have to save Rose." That singular-minded motivation still driving him. Evelyn simply replies, "You were always dead." She pontificates on the fact that he gets bruised, maimed, tortured, and still manages to get up and keep fighting, asking him if it's strange that he can just reattach a broken hand, pour some rubbing alcohol on it, and keep on trucking. She reveals that he died at the Baker house, like died, not just video game died, and he was replaced by mold. All of him, just mold. Evelyn reminds him that he's already dead, but he triumphantly yells he will save Rose before a loading screen cuts back to him rising from the grave one last time to avenge his family. And what better way to draw a comparison between Miranda and Ethan? Both were saved from certain death by an undead mold, and now live on not for themselves but for someone else, using the unique powers they gained from that unliving fungi for their betterment. The mold exaggerates their qualities. Miranda, the eternal mother, both in her own perception of herself and to the village that surrounded and worshipped her. Ethan, the eternal father, only existing in this narrative to save his daughter and wrestle with perceptions of what it means to be a parent in the first place. These aren't particularly complicated characters. They aren't Hamlet waxing on about whether it is better to be dead or alive. Their personalities can both be boiled down to an intense, undying desire to see their loved ones again, no matter the cost. This isn't a flaw of Resident Evil Village, as it is through all the other characters like Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg that we can explore different relationships between children and their parents. That's why we spent so much time with them, gaining insights into the fears that come with becoming a mother or father. In both Ethan and Miranda, we find these fears realized, the loss of a child being the catalyst for both their journeys. The gravity of those losses continues to bring them into orbit with one another until, in the end, they must both die for their child to live on. The Duke, ever useful, gives Ethan a ride to the ceremony site for this final confrontation. Ethan is dying, falling apart, the Duke says, but because this character is nothing more than the paternal urge to protect, nothing will stop him until his daughter is safe, not even death. So, there are no more bells, no more whistles, just Mom and Dad tangling one more time for the soul of their daughter. Ironically, as Miranda completes the ritual, it turns out Rose has already decided for them. She emerges from the Black Root, not reincarnated as Eva, but as herself, and siphons Miranda's power and will to continue on in the process. It doesn't really matter at this point if Rose is literally taking away Miranda's powers, because she has figuratively demolished any hope of Eva returning at the completion of the ritual, rendering all of Miranda's sacrifices and destruction of the eponymous village moot. Ethan confronts her in the ceremony room, and while she poses a true physical threat, Ethan has become an idea, an emotional imperative. He cannot be put down by spooky spider legs or giant claw hands. What's most interesting about this fight is that nearly everything Miranda says about Ethan can be directly applied to her. She sees the connection too, telling Ethan that he understands the love of a parent to her child, don't you? How can you deny me? She says that he has no need of Rose since he is about to die, but she is also losing her powers and closing in on the end, so why does she still fight? She fights because she cannot fully realize being a mother. Meanwhile, Ethan can't fully realize being a father. They have both already lost the material ability to be parents and are decaying rapidly as a result. Every attack they send at the other is simply their dying gasps, each one reaffirming their nature. In the end, Ethan emerges the winner, but it is a Pyrrhic victory. He's wasting away, his journey toward fatherhood complete. This seems a strange ending. After all his suffering, his vindication is just to die at the finish line, just when it looks like he can go back to normal? Yet, this is the only possible ending for Ethan Winters, a character marred by tragedy since the beginning of his quest to save Mia in the previous game. Ethan exists to be tortured, to be put through the meat grinder, sometimes literally, and come out the other end not unscathed, but terribly bruised and beaten. He exists to survive, to save others, but not himself. He exists to sacrifice for those he loves, because that's what fathers do in the fiction of the game. This is the true difference between Ethan and Miranda. Miranda sacrifices others to achieve her goals. She's willing to sacrifice an entire village to make the mold strong, sacrifice her loyal lieutenants to see if Ethan is the right father for her child, sacrifice 100 years of immortality, not to make the world a better place, but to see themselves whole again with their long-lost child. Ethan, on the other hand, has never been whole. Whether it is in the fact that we never see his face, that he loses limbs or fingers left and right, or that at every turn the only thing he sacrifices are pieces of himself, he is the perpetual loser, not a failure, but the one who offers himself in place of others. His reward is the ability to keep dragging his feet after losing his beating heart, just like the zombies of this series. Ethan's purpose is to deteriorate, decompose, and decay. From the fertile soil left behind, others can thrive. This is why Ethan has to fade away with the village he destroys at the end of the story. He is not the survivor. He's the one who holds the door while others get away. It's important to play this character, a staple of the horror genre, as the protagonist in a horror game. Simply put, we're not the final girl. I find this more interesting than the adept military men of other Resident Evil games like Chris Redfield or Leon S. Kennedy. Instead, we're someone who suffers to succeed and succeeds to suffer. This is the picture of parenthood Village ultimately paints. One which speaks to the depths of fear one must overcome to have a child, be a good parent, and the extent to which one will sacrifice for the sake of their children. It's true selflessness, even in the face of annihilation. And Ethan is annihilated for his troubles. Of course, he was never fully there to begin with. We never saw his face, got a rich personality, or even a backstory for the character, because all along we were meant to embody him. I earnestly believe that in the switch to first person, the creators of Biohazard and Village didn't just want to have an easier time scaring players, but were invested in what it would mean for the character action dramas that Resident Evil tells to truly make the player the central character. In Village, they successfully pull it off. It required placing nearly all the thematic weight on its larger-than-life villains and reflecting themes of sacrifice through a broken, battered, and maimed mold body. But the story it tells is powerful, specifically because Ethan is faceless. He could be you, he could be me. Not everyone can save the president's daughter, survive a zombie apocalypse, or take down the nemesis. But everyone is capable of sacrificing for the good of others, and there is something deeply comforting in that thought. After Ethan blows up Mother Miranda and the Megamycete, I don't know, we get a long-deserved break in the form of credits. But our story is not quite finished. During these credits, we return back to the opening fairy tale, The Village of Shadows. Though this time, the story resolves. The daughter's parents find her trapped in the mirror, and the mother breaks the daughter free while the father valiantly fights off the witch. He tells them to run as he continues to fight her, the entire forest erupting into flames. The forest burns down, and the witch and father with it. We then leap forward in time to find an adult Rose reading the book of a father's sacrifice. She observes a mother reading a story to her daughter before getting off at a cemetery to visit her father's grave. Here, those eulogy values are on full display, with the tombstone reading, "A kind husband and a loving father who put family before all else." Exactly the kind of father Ethan grew to be at the end of the story. We learn that Rose tries to visit every week, but her chit-chat with this grave is cut short, interrupted by a shadowy figure in a suit and tie. This man calls her Evelyn before a threat from Rose sets him straight. As they get into the car, the man remarks that she is a lot like her father, to which she responds, "I know," and they drive off. The game fades to black and chooses to repeat what we already know, echo what the initial trailer said. The father's story is now done. Not Ethan's story is now done, or a simple the end. This ending remark punctuates what kind of story Village was meant to be all along. The father's. It's a story of a father's sacrifice for his family, but as we have learned, the game does not simply want the player to see Ethan as a perfect father. They want them to embody him as he grows into becoming a father, learning to overcome the fears of parenthood, whether they be the fear of sex, childbirth, impotence, workaholism, or even the other parent. What's so tragic about Ethan's story is its resolution is his resolution. He doesn't live happily ever after. He burns down with the forest so others might have a chance to live on. Village works its way to this point, and the game earns his sacrifice. To conclude this long-ass discussion of Resident Evil Village, I'd like to consider a question. Is this a story only a game could tell? On the face of it, this is a silly question. There may be no story characters more basic than parents. From films like The Kids Are All Right, Father of the Bride, to Parenthood, to The Godfather, to plays like Hamlet, to novels like 100 Years of Solitude and The Road. Parenthood is a common human topic to take on in media. After all, it's one of the primordial elements of life itself. Moreover, the Resident Evil franchise is one that's constantly translated and adapted into new mediums, whether that be books, terrible Paul W.S. Anderson movies, or the forthcoming feature film that will attempt to reboot the film franchise in the form of the original games. Goodness, I hope this video is out before November 24th when that movie comes out. Otherwise, it won't be forthcoming anymore. So, obviously, the stories of these games could be told in another shape or form. And does it even matter if a game can or should be adapted into a film? It's just a story, right? Humans have presumably been telling each other stories since they could use language. Yet, Resident Evil Village, more so than any other game in the franchise, feels like its story only works because it's a game. Village takes the first-person perspective of its predecessor and truly runs with it. Ethan is faceless, almost nameless, because we are meant to be him. We are meant to conquer our own fears of parenthood through the story. The pieces of this narrative aren't spectacular, and despite the depths to which we've plunged in this video, they aren't really that complicated. Outside of Biohazard, this might be the least complex Resident Evil game in terms of the scope of its plot. Government conspiracies and double crosses are barely visible through the haze of its Eastern European setting. Like the children's fairy tale that frames the entire game, this is straightforward and easy to read, because this is as much our journey through a twisted village as it is Ethan's. We see his hands and command his actions, but we do not glimpse his face. Thus, we are as much the parent as Ethan is. We are as present in his journey as he is. Ethan is tortured and battered from start to finish to replicate our own shortcomings as players. I don't think the story is as impactful or meaningful without the viewer's participation. The less of a character Ethan is, the less we are meant to empathize with him, and the more we are meant to identify as him. He is undefined, so that we can be defined as players with fears to explore and overcome through him. We may get scared, lose motivation to play, shirk back from the challenge, but that only sweetens the taste of victory as we master that which controlled us. This is the best trick the Resident Evil franchise ever had up its sleeve as a decidedly action-oriented survival horror franchise. Not just playing up the player's ability to be scared of their environment, of bizarre otherworldly creatures, or latent fears common to our age, but giving the viewer the opportunity to experience that terror and then find a way to subdue it, even if it tends to be shooting the problem until you're out of bullets. That's the beauty of Resident Evil Village, and I'm unsure if the next game will be able to capture the same spirit. But even if it doesn't, we'll always have Mother Miranda and her cabal of monstrous children to re-experience if we grow bored with where the franchise goes next. Until next time, I'm Error, not as scared as when I started writing this. Signing off. Well, you've made it to the end of the video, so congratulations. This part's going to be less scripted. Even those other parts where I was talking to the camera in between editing, I was scripted. I had written down sentences beforehand. Here I've got some thank yous I want to dole out, and I want to give credit for some of the work that I borrowed, I guess, for this video. And I want to talk a little bit about some other things kind of going on with the channel. So if that doesn't interest you, you can check out. Like, there's no more big stuff about Resident Evil Village for me to discuss. I think I've said all I want to say about Resident Evil Village for a while. All right, so let's get started. First of all, I really want to thank my wife. She has been super supportive of me making these videos, and in so much of these videos that you may not even notice, she had a hand in. So for instance, like, she helped set up the camera for most of the segments, not this one, but she made sure it was level and everything that looked good and stuff like that. My cat right now is in my lap. She wants pets. She's just gonna come lie down. Okay. So she's great. She helped set up the sets. On particular, she's just super encouraging, and she lifts my spirits. One story quick. I wanted to record the Lady Dimitrescu where I'm wearing, the hat and I've got the white shirt on. I wanted to record those in the attic that we have upstairs, but we went up there, we set up the whole set, and we got ready to record, and we had issues with the microphone. It just sounded atrocious. There was some sort of radio interference, and I didn't have an easy solution, and I was just super bummed out. I spent like hours just not getting anything done. I was so frustrated. This was on my birthday, by the way. I recorded all the Lady Dimitrescu segments on my birthday, and I recorded all the Ethan segments on the next day. But anyways, she suggested that we just film it in the basement, and she actually went down and she cleared out a space. She said, "Hey, look at this. Like, this will be great." I think it turned out pretty well. You might be able to hear my cat rumbling right now. So just thank you so much to my wife, because I just don't think I could do this without her. Someone else I really want to thank is Janelle. Janelle is my colleague where I work, and one of my best friends too. And she's been so encouraging throughout the whole process. She's read quite a few of the scripts for my videos before they've gone live, just checking them for like general errors. And for this one, she read the whole thing. It's like 30,000 words. Like, that's like a novella length. Like, so reading all of that for a friend that's a big commitment. And so I am super grateful for Janelle. She didn't just contribute, she didn't just read it. She obviously left feedback that influenced how it turned out. And she helped me by giving me one of the sources, the Zipes source. She's like, "Hey, you should put this in here," and it made its way in, so you can see how impactful that was. So thank you so much, Janelle. Oh, and she did voice work too. She did the voice for, I think, one of the designers for Village. Next up, I want to thank the wonderful voice talent who all came to my aid. That would include HotCyder, Questing Refuge, Afterthoughts, PixelaDay, Kevin or Arcadology, DarkFry, and HeavyEyed. All of you guys, thank you so much for lending your voices to this project of mine. You should check out, most of them are YouTubers too. You should check out their videos, really, they're very good. If you like what I do, I think you're very likely to like what they do too. Also, I want to thank World of Longplays and Snoman Gaming. I had a lot of trouble recording footage of Resident Evil Village. My computer just couldn't handle it very well. So I ended up having to use some open, free to use gameplay streams of Resident Evil Village. And so a lot of the footage you see in the game, a lot of the footage you see in the video, some of it's me, but most of it is not. Most of it was from either World of Longplays video of it or Snoman Gameplays video of it. So just thank you so much to you guys. Lastly, for the thanks I have here though, I probably could keep thanking people. I just wrote up a quick list, right? But last on the list here is all the musicians, right, who made this stuff possible. So most of the classical music I got on IMSLP, which is like this database where you can get free music like Creative Commons. And then a lot of the video game music that you hear is from a whole slew of video games, including Omori, Celeste, Eichenfeld, Ultra Kill, the Wii, and of course, the Resident Evil games. There's other stuff from like Earthbound, Undertale, Super Mario 64 too, but the Resident Evil games, like so much of the music here is just from the Resident Evil games, and I'm really grateful that I was able to do that. Oh, one last one, the Gran Turismo games too. I used quite a bit of some of the classical music from the Gran Turismo games, so just want a huge shout out. Those are great resources. You should support IMSLP, support anyone who's like making music that you can freaking use on YouTube. Like, it's such a headache to like use music on YouTube. I really hope that I don't run into any copyright issues with this one. All right, now that we've got the thanks out of the way, there are some actually interesting additional thoughts I do want to kind of remark upon at the end of this video. So the first one is game design. I did not talk much at all about the game design of Resident Evil Village in this video, and it's something that didn't even cross my mind until I was like in the production phase of like actually recording it. I was like, wait, I just don't talk at all about like the game of Resident Evil Village. But I think if you've watched the video and you've made it this far, you probably have, I really hope you've recognized that I think that this is a story that only a game can tell. Like, I think the fact that this is a game is really important. Just because I don't talk about the game's design doesn't mean that I'm just talking about this as if it were a movie. I think the character of Ethan Winters is really designed for the player to embody them, right? That's like the whole point of the video. And so the fact that we are taking these actions as we're going through is really important. The fact that we are getting scared while playing is really important. And I try to emphasize that throughout the video. Not so much the bullet scrounging survival horror aspects of the game, not so much the boss's design. Is it interesting? Is it good? If you watch my other videos, you'll see that I definitely talk about that kind of stuff a lot. So it's not like I don't have that in my toolbox. It just didn't come up for this one. I think Village, on a really general level, has just good design. It's not something that like I ruminated on a lot while making this video, obviously, but also not even while playing. I think it's just really good. It's almost what I would describe as invisible design, in the sense that the game doesn't want you to be thinking about how it's designed. I hope my description of like invisible design makes sense to you. Like, I don't think it's design that calls attention to itself. I think it's, generally speaking, it's just very competent, Village's game design. And I think that works well. I do not like the Chris Redfield section, because, in part because I don't think this game's like kind of, I don't think the RE engine is like great at doing like first person shooter mechanics. It's not like Ultra Kill or something, right? So it felt weird to be like a super soldier. I felt like I turned on God mode when I played Chris, and I didn't like that very much at all. So that's one thing I didn't talk about in the video very much, but I hope you understand why I didn't talk about it a little bit more now. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the conclusion. Janelle actually said that she wanted me to just write more on the conclusion. She wanted me to specifically talk a little bit more about Ethan being kind of faceless and being this avatar for the player. And I think that I covered that enough throughout the video that I didn't feel the need to wax on about it for like 10 more minutes at the end. That said, maybe I could talk about it a little bit right now. If you've been paying attention to Resident Evil Village, you are definitely familiar with how weird it is. They specifically try to never show Ethan's face. And I think that that's a really deliberate move. And I think that's something worth dissecting. And that's maybe something see, here's the thing. If I had had a section of the video, like there's like part 1, I Am a Scaredy Cat, part 2, The Curse of the Video Game sequel. If I had a section of the video that was just like the context of Resident Evil Village, I would have spent like 3 minutes or so talking about Ethan Winters not having a face. But that isn't in the video. There isn't a section of the video. I didn't have enough to make that part. And 8 parts, Resident Evil 8, like, I mean, come on. It's perfect. The video's perfect. It's not perfect. Oh wait, but anyways, Ethan doesn't have a face in these promotional materials in the game. Like in the game, if you try to look at your face, right, they don't even put mirrors in the game, right? You're not supposed to know what Ethan looks like. It's because you are supposed to think of yourself as Ethan. There are some issues with that. I mean, part of it is that like Ethan pretty much only says things like "fuck you" and like "where's my daughter?" He just doesn't ooze character. He's not particularly interesting. I think if you look up online, like people hate this guy. A lot of the Like, I was looking at something today and it's like somebody said, like, Ethan Winters is horrible character. Like, and it's just like, people hate this guy. And I would say that their criticisms are probably justified. If you're looking for a character that's, like, really defined, that Ethan Winters isn't it. But the fact that he's not defined is the point, right? And that's the point I try to make in this video. And so, suffice to say, I don't know how much more I want to say on it because I just spent the whole video talking about it. But I think if you want to understand Resident Evil Village, you should play it with the idea in mind that you are the parent. And interrogate how each segment of the game kind of relates to fears of parenthood and fears that parents have for their children. I think that is really where the most fruitful discussions around Village can be had. And that's why this video exists. So last, I wanted to just mention that this video is coming out right around my 1-year anniversary. I'm recording this. I don't know when the video is exactly going to come out. Probably won't come out on the 1-year anniversary, but will come out very soon thereafter. And I want to say thanks for the wonderful year. It was my first year on YouTube. I started this channel in part because my advisor, just in case you don't know, I'm a PhD student. I'm writing my dissertation right now. It's on time and games. Really excited. I'm really excited to keep writing this dissertation. But anyways, I started this YouTube channel in part because I thought it would be interesting as part of my academic work to make videos. I mentioned this to my advisor and he was ecstatic. He thought it was an excellent idea. He was all on board. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do this as part of my dissertation, I should probably know a little bit about video editing. So I started this primarily as just a thing to start getting experience in video editing and video making. And it's just grown, and I mean, I don't think it's, not massive. I don't even have a Patreon or anything, right? And that's not to say that I won't ever have a Patreon or anything, but more so my point is that, like, I'm not like, I'm not making a living on this or anything like that, but in the first year, this has been really fun. I really have liked making videos, and I really liked making this longer video specifically. And so, depending on how this video goes, if this video just completely flops and people aren't interested in like listening to me for 3 hours straight, which I don't know if other videos are going to be 3 hours long, by the way, then I probably won't do this long term. Like, right? I won't just come out with an hour and a half, 2 hour long video every other month or something like that. Though that could be really interesting. And if this proves, to have an audience, right? People really like this kind of thing that I'm making. I want to do more. I found it a lot more fulfilling and rewarding to make a much longer video. If you notice, a lot of my videos are 15, 20 minutes long. That's like the average, 10 to 20 minutes. And I think a lot of people think that what YouTubers like me might do is like, well, you got to get 10 minutes to get ad revenue or something. By the way, I didn't have any opportunity to get ad revenue until like a month ago. So like that didn't influence at all any of my videos, but 10 to 20 minutes is kind of like a sweet spot. It feels like a good length for an analysis video, just in general. Like, it doesn't feel too long, it doesn't feel too short. But what ends up happening is that you tailor what ideas you might have a video about around the idea that those videos are going to end up being 10 or 20 minutes. And I think that leads to creative stagnation a little bit, because what ends up happening is you only think about games in what can I discuss about this game in 15 to 20 minutes. My cat is playing in the other room. You're just gonna have to deal with it. And as you can tell from this video, you can do a lot more if you are exploring other avenues, if you are going deeper, if you are not limiting yourself by 10 to 20 minutes, right? I mean, heck, like I discussed Heisenberg for like 20 minutes, right, in this one video. And like, I guess that could have been a video on its own, but I don't think it would make sense without the context of what came before it and what came after it. And so I think I want to make more longer videos. I like the freedom that's afforded by them, rather than trying to think of something like, I'm playing Ultra Kill, I really like it. Okay, what's an idea I have about Ultra Kill that I could fit within a normal, reasonable sized video? Instead, I can just I want to just go wild, right? I just want to run with it and see where it takes me, rather than worrying about stuff like that. So ideally, this is the kind of content I want to make moving forward. Big, longer video essays. But I think that is very much contingent on whether or not these have an audience. And I know that that's maybe a little bit shallow because it's for me, but it's worth noting that these really long videos are a lot of work, right? Like this, I have spent so much time making this Resident Evil video. And if I don't end up feeling like that effort was worth it, then it doesn't matter if this is the kind of thing that I want to make in the grand scheme, right? It's not like I hate making 15 to 20 minute videos. Don't get that impression at all. So yeah, that's a little bit about the channel. That's a little bit about where we want to go next. And just thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please, all those things, right? I think it's smash the like button, hit the subscribe, smash the subscribe button and the like button for me. And why don't you come join us on our Discord, where I give updates on what I'm doing, and we're going to try to play some games together sometime. Follow me on Twitter, I guess. I make bad jokes about fast food. And as you can tell, I'm kind of running out of steam here, so we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for watching. Sincerely. You've just completed, I made something in 2 or 3 months that is 3-ish hours long, right? And you've watched it all. And that is amazing. That's amazing to me that I was able to hold your attention for that long. I really hope that it was worth it for you, because my number one goal with these videos that I make, and since day one, was that I don't want to waste your time. And I know this is a really long video, but I really hope that you don't feel like your time was wasted, that you really got something out of this. All right, thank you so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.